The wind howled through the empty streets, rattling loose shutters and sending leaves skittering across the pavement like frightened whispers. Under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, Clara Walker pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. The clock on her phone read 11:47 p.m., too late to be walking home, even in a neighborhood as quiet as this. She took a deep breath, her boots crunching against the gravel as she tried to shake the uneasy feeling that had been nagging at her since she left work. The storm clouds above rumbled ominously, promising rain that hadn't yet arrived. Clara quickened her pace, the cold air biting at her cheeks. And then, she heard it. A faint sound at first, tires humming against the pavement. She turned her head slightly, her heart beginning to race as the sound grew louder. The rhythmic squeak of chains joined the hum, echoing eerily in the night. Cyclists. Clara glanced over her shoulder and saw them emerging from the shadows, one by one. At first, there were 3, then 4, then 6. They rode in unison, their faces obscured by scarves and dark helmets, their black-clad forms blending into the night. The leader, taller and broader than the others, slowed his bike until he was riding parallel to her. "Nice night for a stroll, isn't it?" he said, his voice smooth and taunting. Clara didn't respond. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her expression remained calm. She shifted her weight slightly, readying herself. The cyclists fanned out, surrounding her in a slow, deliberate motion. Their tires hissed against the pavement as they circled like predators, sizing up their prey. "What's the rush?" another voice sneered from behind her. Clara stopped walking. Her breath clouded the air as she exhaled, her mind racing. She had been in tough situations before, but this was different. The way they moved, the confidence in their posture. It was clear this wasn't a random encounter. "Let me pass," she said, her voice steady. The leader chuckled, his helmet tilting slightly as he studied her. "Feisty, aren't you?" He leaned forward on his handlebars. "But see, we're not really the letting pass type." The circle tightened, and Clara's fingers curled into fists inside her coat pockets. She scanned her surroundings. An alleyway to her left, a narrow row of bushes to her right. Escape options were limited. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, sharp and clear. "Assess. Adapt. Act." Clara took a deep breath. "If you're looking for trouble," she said, locking eyes with the leader, "you've picked the wrong person." The group laughed, but their amusement was short-lived. Clara shifted her weight and, in one fluid motion, swung her bag off her shoulder and hurled it at the leader's chest. He flinched, momentarily losing his balance, and that split-second distraction was all she needed. She darted toward the alleyway, her legs pumping as adrenaline surged through her veins. The cyclists shouted in surprise, their tires screeching as they scrambled to follow. The alley was dark and narrow, with stacks of crates and trash cans forming an obstacle course. Clara weaved through them effortlessly, her body moving on instinct. Behind her, she could hear the clatter of bikes as the cyclists tried to navigate the tight space. "Get her!" someone yelled. Clara spotted a fire escape ladder, hanging low enough for her to reach. She jumped, grabbing hold of the cold metal and pulling herself up just as one of the cyclists lunged for her ankle. "Too slow," she muttered under her breath, climbing higher. From her vantage point, she could see the cyclists regrouping below, their frustration palpable. The leader removed his helmet, revealing a face that was both sharp and cruel. He looked up at her, his eyes glinting with a mix of anger and intrigue. "This isn't over," he called out. "We'll find you again." Clara didn't respond. She climbed onto the rooftop and crouched low, catching her breath as she listened to the sound of the cyclists retreating into the night. The wind whipped around her, carrying the first drops of rain. Clara stared out at the city skyline, her mind racing. Who were they? And why did it feel like this was only the beginning? The storm raged outside, rain pelting against the windows of Clara's tiny apartment. She sat at the kitchen table, still in her coat, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. Her mind replayed the events of the night. The cyclists, their taunts, the way they seemed so certain they'd catch her. She wasn't scared. At least, that's what she told herself. But deep down, she felt something else. Not fear, exactly, Something sharper. Anger. Clara's apartment was sparse but tidy. The walls were lined with bookshelves, most of them filled with old novels, psychology texts, and a few well-worn tactical guides her father had given her. Above the table hung a single framed photograph. Her father, Sergeant James Walker, standing in uniform with a serious but proud expression. Her gaze lingered on the photo. "What would you do, Dad?" she murmured. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, clear and firm. "You don't wait for trouble to find you. You get ahead of it." Clara sighed and leaned back in her chair. She hadn't thought about him this much in years. He'd been gone for nearly a decade now, but his lessons had stayed with her, whether she wanted them to or not. The memory came unbidden, as vivid as if she were back there again. She was 13, standing in their backyard, her fists wrapped in gauze. Her father circled her, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow in the afternoon sun. "Balance, Clara," he said, his voice firm but encouraging. "If you lose your footing, you lose control." She frowned, wiping sweat from her forehead. "But I don't want to fight, Dad." "It's not about wanting to fight," he replied, stepping closer. "It's about knowing how to protect yourself when there's no other option." He crouched to her level, his expression softening. "Someday, you'll thank me for this. The world isn't always kind, kiddo. You need to be ready for that." The memory faded, leaving Clara staring at her reflection in the darkened window. Her father had always seemed invincible, but life had a way of proving otherwise. His death had left her alone, forced to fend for herself far earlier than she'd ever imagined. She thought of her mother, too, though those memories were hazier. Her mother had disappeared when Clara was just 6. No explanations, no goodbyes. Just gone. Her father had never spoken much about it, but Clara had always suspected there was more to the story. She'd stopped asking questions when it became clear he wouldn't answer. Her thoughts were interrupted by the faint hum of tires outside. Clara froze, her muscles tensing. She set the mug down carefully and moved to the window, parting the curtains just enough to peer outside. A single cyclist stood at the end of the block, illuminated by the dim streetlight. It wasn't Alex. This figure was smaller, less imposing, but they were unmistakably part of the same group. Clara watched as the cyclist remained motionless, their face obscured by a dark helmet. After a few moments, they turned and pedaled away, disappearing into the rain-soaked night. Her jaw tightened. They were watching her. She stepped back from the window and took a steadying breath. If they thought she was an easy target, they were wrong. Clara moved to the bookshelf, her fingers trailing along the spines until she found what she was looking for. A small, leather-bound journal. It was her father's, filled with notes, sketches, and tactical advice. She flipped it open to a page she'd read 100 times before. Control the environment. If you can't find an advantage, create one. Her lips pressed into a thin line. This wasn't just about her anymore. If the cyclists were bold enough to target her, what was stopping them from going after others? The next morning, Clara made her way to the corner coffee shop. It was a cozy little spot, the kind of place where the baristas knew your name and your order. She wasn't a regular, but she'd stopped in often enough to recognize a few familiar faces. Emma, her neighbor from 2 doors down, was sitting near the window with her young son. Max. Clara hesitated before approaching, but Emma looked up and smiled warmly. "Clara, come join us," Emma said, waving her over. Clara slid into the seat across from them, her eyes briefly meeting Max's curious gaze before turning to Emma. "You're up early," she said, forcing a small smile. "Max insisted," Emma replied, ruffling the boy's hair. "He says the rain makes the hot chocolate taste better." Clara chuckled softly, but her mind was elsewhere. She glanced out the window, scanning the street for anything, or anyone, out of place. "Are you okay?" Emma asked, her smile fading slightly. Clara hesitated. She didn't want to drag anyone else into this, but Emma was one of the few people she trusted. "Did you hear anything strange last night?" Clara asked finally, keeping her voice low. Emma frowned. "Strange how?" "Cyclists. A group of them, riding around late. Did they come by your street?" Emma's expression darkened, and she glanced at Max before leaning closer. "They've been around a lot lately, mostly at night. I don't know what they're up to, but it's unsettling. Clara nodded slowly. She wasn't imagining it. The cyclists were escalating, and she needed to figure out why. Max tugged at Emma's sleeve. "Mom, can we go home now?" he asked, his voice small. Emma smiled softly and kissed his forehead. "Of course, sweetheart." She turned back to Clara. "Be careful, okay? There's something off about them." "I will," Clara promised. But as she watched them leave, she knew being careful wasn't enough. She had a choice to make: stay quiet and hope the cyclists left her alone, or take action before things got worse. Clara tightened her grip on the journal in her bag. She already knew her answer. The early morning fog clung to the streets like a ghostly veil as Clara stepped out of her apartment, her breath forming faint clouds in the cool air. A sense of purpose coursed through her veins. Last night's encounter wasn't just a warning, it was a challenge. And Clara had never been the type to back down. The journal rested securely in her bag, along with a small flashlight, a multipurpose tool her dad had given her years ago, and a thermos of strong black coffee. She wasn't sure what she was walking into, but she knew she had to be prepared. Clara's plan was simple: start at the alley where she'd escaped the cyclists the night before and follow any leads she could find. The city was large, but these cyclists had a pattern. They'd been seen in her neighborhood repeatedly, and something told her they weren't here by chance. The alley was quiet now, the rain-washed pavement gleaming under the pale morning light. Clara crouched near a scuffed patch of ground where the cyclists had regrouped. Tire tracks crisscrossed the area, leading away in several directions. She pulled out her phone, snapping pictures of the tracks before standing and following the most distinct trail. It led her deeper into the industrial part of the city, where abandoned warehouses and crumbling factories stood as relics of a bygone era. As Clara rounded a corner, she spotted a graffiti tag on the side of a warehouse. A black wheel with jagged edges, encircled by flames. It was crude but unmistakable, and it matched a symbol she'd seen on one of the cyclists' helmets. "This must be their turf," she muttered. The door to the warehouse was slightly ajar, a faint creak emanating as the wind pushed it back and forth. Clara hesitated. She knew walking into their territory alone was risky, but she didn't have much of a choice. "Control the environment," her father's voice reminded her. "Observe before you act." Clara slipped inside, her footsteps light and deliberate. The air inside was heavy with the smell of oil and damp concrete. Stacks of old crates and broken machinery created a maze-like layout, and the faint hum of voices echoed from somewhere deeper within the building. She crouched behind a stack of crates, peeking around the corner to find a group of cyclists gathered near a makeshift table. Maps and papers were spread across it, illuminated by a single overhead bulb. The leader, Alex, as she'd heard someone call him last night, was leaning over the table, his sharp features tense as he barked orders. "She slipped through last night," he said, his voice low but commanding. "That won't happen again. We need her, and we need her alive." Clara's heart skipped a beat. They were after me? Why? As she shifted her position, her elbow accidentally knocked over a small wrench lying on the ground. It clattered loudly, and every head in the room snapped in her direction. "Who's there?" Alex demanded, grabbing a flashlight from the table. Clara ducked behind the crates, cursing under her breath. She could hear the sound of footsteps approaching, accompanied by the click of a knife being unsheathed. Her mind raced. She needed a distraction, fast. Spotting a stack of rusty metal pipes nearby, she grabbed a loose one and threw it toward the opposite end of the room. The pipes crashed to the ground with a deafening clang, and the cyclists immediately turned toward the noise. "Over there!" someone shouted. Taking advantage of the chaos, Clara slipped out from behind the crates and darted toward the door. She could hear Alex yelling orders behind her, but she didn't stop to look back. The cold air hit her like a slap as she burst out of the warehouse and into the foggy morning. Her legs burned as she sprinted down the street, her lungs heaving with every breath. Clara didn't stop running until she was back in the relative safety of her apartment. She locked the door behind her and leaned against it, her heart pounding. She'd gotten away, but the realization that they were specifically targeting her sent a chill down her spine. Pulling the journal from her bag, she flipped through the pages, looking for anything that might give her a clue about why the cyclists were after her. Toward the back, she found a note her father had scribbled years ago. "If you're ever in trouble, look for the wheel on fire." It's a warning and a key. Don't ignore it. Her breath caught in her throat. The flaming wheel graffiti wasn't just a gang symbol. It was connected to her father. Clara sat down at the table, her hands trembling as she tried to piece everything together. The cyclists weren't just a random group harassing her. They had a purpose. And somehow, it all tied back to her father. She thought about her mother's disappearance, the cryptic warnings her father had given her as a child, and the journal filled with advice that now felt more like a survival guide. Her fingers hovered over her phone. She needed help, but the police wouldn't believe her without proof. And she couldn't trust just anyone. Clara's eyes narrowed. If her father had left her breadcrumbs, she'd follow them, starting with the flaming wheel. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The morning light was sharper now, streaming through Clara's window as she stared at the journal on the table. Her father's words, "The wheel on fire," a warning and a key, echoed in her mind. It felt less like a clue and more like a challenge, a message left for her to decipher. But the warning part had become abundantly clear. Clara leaned back in her chair, the events of the past night replaying like a broken reel. The cyclists weren't just random troublemakers. They were organized, they had a purpose, and for some reason, they wanted her alive. Her fingers drummed against the table as she studied the page. The flaming wheel symbol wasn't entirely unfamiliar. Clara vaguely remembered seeing it once before, years ago, on the cover of an old folder her father had locked away in a desk drawer. She'd been too young to understand its significance at the time, but now it felt like a missing piece of the puzzle. Her father had warned her about things, dangerous people, hidden threats, but always in veiled terms. He'd been preparing her for something, and now she was starting to wonder if this was it. Clara grabbed her phone, scrolling through her contacts. She didn't have many people she trusted, but there was one name that stood out: Nate Harper. Nate had been her father's closest friend and a retired detective. After her father's death, Nate had checked in on Clara occasionally, offering advice and a listening ear when she needed it. He'd always told her to call if she ever found herself in over her head. She hesitated for a moment, then hit the call button. "Clara?" Nate's deep, gravelly voice came through the line after the second ring. "It's been a while. What's going on?" "I need your help," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "It's about my dad, and something he might have been involved in." There was a pause. "Meet me at Mac's Diner in an hour," Nate said. "We'll talk there." The diner was a relic of another time, with red leather booths and a jukebox in the corner that hadn't worked in years. Clara arrived early, choosing a booth near the back where she had a clear view of the entrance. Nate walked in a few minutes later, his tall frame filling the doorway. His gray hair was slicked back, and his trench coat looked like it had seen one too many stakeouts. He gave her a nod and slid into the seat across from her. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, signaling for the waitress. "Something like that," Clara replied. She wasted no time, pulling out the journal and flipping to the page with the note about the flaming wheel. "I think my dad was involved in something big, and now it's coming back to haunt me." Nate's brow furrowed as he read the note. "The wheel on fire," he muttered. "Haven't heard that name in a long time." "You know what it means?" Clara asked, leaning forward. Nate nodded slowly. "It's not a name. It's a symbol tied to an old group your dad worked with during his time in the military. They called themselves the Inferno Network, a covert task force designed to dismantle dangerous organizations. But they operated in the gray area, off the books. No oversight, no rules." Clara's stomach churned. "Why would they be after me?" Nate hesitated. "If they're after you, it's not random. Either they think you know something, or you're holding something they want. What else did your dad leave you?" "Just the journal," Clara said, though even as she spoke, a memory surfaced. Her father handing her a small, locked box on the night before he died. "Keep this safe," he'd said, "and don't open it unless you absolutely have to." Clara's eyes widened. "There's a box," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He gave it to me before he died. I still have it, but I've never opened it." Nate's expression darkened. You need to find that box, Clara. If your father was involved with the Inferno network, whatever's in that box could be the key to everything. And if the cyclists are part of this, they're part of it, Clara interjected. I overheard them saying they needed me alive. And I found their symbol, the flaming wheel, on a warehouse near the docks. Nate ran a hand over his face, his jaw tight. This is bigger than I thought, he muttered. You're not safe, Clara. If they're after you, they won't stop until they get what they want. Clara leaned back, her mind racing. She couldn't keep running forever. Sooner or later, she'd have to confront them and find out the truth about her father's past. I'll get the box, she said finally, but I need to figure out what's inside it before they do. Nate nodded. I'll help you, but you have to promise me you'll be careful. These people don't play by the rules. Clara's lips curved into a faint, determined smile. Neither do I. As Nate got up to leave, Clara stayed behind for a moment, finishing her coffee as she stared out the window. The storm was coming, and she could feel it. But this time, she wasn't running away. Back at her apartment, Clara sat cross-legged on the floor, the small locked box resting in front of her. It was heavy, its metallic surface worn but sturdy. She ran her fingers over its surface, tracing the faint scratches and dents, trying to imagine the journey it had taken before it ended up in her hands. The key, she remembered, was hidden in her father's favorite book, The Old Man and the Sea. Clara pulled the tattered copy from her bookshelf and flipped through the pages until the small, brass key fell into her palm. Her breath caught as she inserted the key into the lock. The mechanism clicked, and the lid popped open with a quiet hiss. Inside, there was a manila envelope, a small USB drive, and a folded piece of paper. Clara unfolded the paper first. Her father's handwriting was unmistakable, neat and precise, but with a hint of urgency. Clara, if you're reading this, it means the past has caught up to us. I'm sorry for the burden this will place on you, but you're stronger than you realize. The USB contains everything I've worked to protect. They'll stop at nothing to get it. Trust no one, except Nate. He'll know what to do. Love, Dad. Clara's heart ached as she read the words. Her father had always been a stoic man, a pillar of strength in her life. But now, through his words, she could feel his fear and his love. She picked up the USB drive, turning it over in her hand. What could possibly be on it that was worth so much trouble? Her laptop sat on the table, its screen dark and waiting. Clara hesitated. Plugging the USB into her computer felt like opening Pandora's box. But she needed answers. The drive loaded quickly, revealing a single folder labeled Inferno. Inside were dozens of files, photos, documents, and video recordings. The first file she opened was a photograph of a group of men and women in tactical gear. Her father was among them, younger, and wearing the same determined expression she remembered. On their uniforms was the flaming wheel emblem. As she scrolled through the files, the picture became clearer. The Inferno network had been more than a covert task force. It had been a secret arm of the government, dismantling criminal organizations and rogue agencies. But something had gone wrong. One of the documents, marked classified, detailed an operation called Project Eclipse. It had been the Inferno network's last mission, an attempt to infiltrate a global trafficking ring that had ties to powerful political figures. But someone within the team had betrayed them, selling out their identities to the very people they were trying to stop. Clara's father had been one of the few who escaped the fallout. The rest of the team either disappeared or were eliminated. Her hands trembled as she closed the document. This is why they're after me, she thought. They think I have the answers they need to finish what they started. Finally, Clara turned her attention to the manila envelope. Inside were more photos, but these were different. They were surveillance shots of her. One showed her at a coffee shop, another at her workplace, and one chilling photo was of her standing in her apartment window. Her blood ran cold. They've been watching me, she whispered. The last item in the envelope was a map of the city with several locations marked in red. One of them was the warehouse she'd visited earlier. Another was an abandoned train yard near the edge of town. Clara grabbed her phone and called Nate. You were right, she said as soon as he answered. The box, it's bigger than I imagined. There's a USB drive with files on the Inferno network and photos of me, surveillance photos. Nate cursed under his breath. You're in deeper than I thought. Where are you now? At my apartment, but I need to get out of here. They know where I live, Clara said, glancing nervously at the window. Pack a bag and meet me at the old train yard, Nate instructed. It's one of the locations your dad mentioned to me years ago, a safe house. I'll explain everything when we meet. Clara moved quickly, throwing essentials into a backpack. Clothes, a flashlight, her father's journal, and the USB drive. She felt exposed, as if eyes were on her even now. Just as she zipped up her bag, she heard the faint hum of motorcycles in the distance. Her stomach dropped. Peering through the blinds, she saw a group of cyclists turning onto her street. Not again, she muttered, slinging the bag over her shoulder. She bolted out the back door, slipping into the alleyway behind her building. The sound of the motorcycles grew louder as she sprinted down the alley, her feet pounding against the pavement. She could hear them now, their voices calling to each other as they spread out, searching for her. Clara ducked into a side street, her mind racing. She needed to reach the train yard before they caught up to her. A cyclist appeared at the end of the street, his head snapping in her direction. Clara turned and ran, her legs burning as she pushed herself harder. Up ahead, she spotted a delivery truck idling at a red light. Without thinking, she darted toward it and climbed into the back just as the light turned green. The truck rumbled forward, carrying her away from the danger. As she sat in the dark, her heart pounding, Clara realized something. She wasn't just running from the past anymore. She was running straight toward it. The delivery truck slowed to a stop, its brakes hissing. Clara peeked through the crack in the rear doors and saw the dimly lit expanse of the train yard stretching out before her. Rusted rail cars sat on overgrown tracks, their hulking forms cloaked in shadows. The place looked abandoned, but she knew better than to trust appearances. Slipping out of the truck, she crouched low and scanned her surroundings. The air was heavy with the smell of metal and damp earth, and the faint hum of distant traffic reminded her that civilization wasn't far away. But here, in this desolate yard, she felt entirely cut off from the world. Her phone buzzed. It was Nate. "I'm here," she whispered, keeping her voice low. "Where are you?" "Head toward the control tower," Nate replied. "It's the tall building near the center of the yard." "I'm inside." Clara spotted the tower, its silhouette barely visible against the night sky. She started moving, sticking to the shadows and avoiding open spaces. Every sound, a creak of metal, the rustle of leaves, set her nerves on edge. The control tower was a relic of a bygone era, its windows shattered and its paint peeling. Clara climbed the metal stairs cautiously, her hand gripping the railing as it groaned under her weight. At the top, she found Nate waiting for her, his figure outlined by the glow of a single lantern. He looked more tired than before, his eyes shadowed and his expression grim. "Close the door," he said. Clara did as he asked, then dropped her bag on the floor. "What is this place?" "Your father called it the Haven," Nate said. "It was a fallback spot for members of the Inferno network when things went south. He told me about it in case anything ever happened to him." Clara frowned. "Why didn't he tell me?" "He was trying to protect you," Nate replied. "But it looks like that didn't work out too well." Clara handed Nate the USB drive and explained what she'd found in the box: the files, the surveillance photos, and the map with marked locations. Nate plugged the USB into a laptop he'd brought and began scanning the files. "This is explosive," he said after a few minutes. "Your father kept records of everything. The missions, the people involved, even the betrayal. If this information gets out, it could destroy some very powerful individuals." "Why did he keep it?" Clara asked. "Wouldn't it have been safer to get rid of it?" Nate shook his head. "Your father believed in accountability. He knew that without these records, the people responsible would never face justice. But he also knew how dangerous this information was. That's why he hid it, and why they're hunting you now." Clara paced the small room, her mind racing. "So what do we do? We can't just sit here and wait for them to find us." Nate leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "We need to stay one step ahead. The marked locations on the map might give us a clue about what they're planning next." If we can figure out their endgame, we might have a chance to stop them. Clara pulled out the map and spread it on the table. The warehouse was one location, and this train yard is another. But what about the others? Do you recognize any of them? Nate studied the map, his brow furrowed. This one, he said, pointing to a spot near the outskirts of the city. It's an old airfield. The Inferno network used it as a staging ground for their missions. If the cyclists are part of the group that betrayed your father, they might be using it now. Clara nodded. Then that's where we go next. As they finalized their plan, neither of them noticed the faint glint of a camera lens hidden among the shadows outside the control tower. Far below, in the darkness of the train yard, a figure watched through binoculars, their movements silent and deliberate. The cyclists hadn't given up. They had followed Clara here, and now they were closing in. Clara was the first to sense something was wrong. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she felt a sudden chill. "Nate," she said, her voice low. "We're not alone." Nate reached for the pistol he kept holstered at his side. "Stay behind me," he ordered, moving toward the window. Outside, shadows shifted between the rail cars. Clara counted at least 5 figures, all dressed in dark clothing. One of them stepped into the open, a burly man with a flaming wheel emblem on his leather jacket. He raised a hand, signaling the others to surround the tower. "They've got us pinned," Nate muttered. Clara's mind raced. They couldn't fight their way out, not against these odds. But running wasn't an option either. "There's a maintenance hatch under the floor," Nate said suddenly. "It leads to a tunnel that comes out near the edge of the yard. We can use it to escape." They worked quickly, moving the table and prying open the hatch. Nate climbed down first, then helped Clara descend into the narrow, damp tunnel below. The sound of boots stomping on the stairs above made Clara's heart pound. The cyclists were in the tower now, their voices echoing as they searched the room. Clara and Nate moved through the tunnel as quietly as possible, the dim light from Nate's flashlight guiding their way. As they reached the exit, Clara heard a voice behind them, loud and taunting. "You can't run forever, Clara." Her blood turned to ice. They knew her name. The tunnel exit opened into a grove of trees on the outskirts of the train yard. Clara and Nate emerged cautiously, the cool night air a welcome reprieve from the tunnel's suffocating dampness. The distant rumble of motorcycles still echoed in her ears, a constant reminder that their pursuers weren't far behind. "We need to move," Nate said, scanning the horizon. "The airfield is about 5 miles from here. If we stay off the main roads, we might be able to reach it before they catch up." Clara nodded, adjusting her backpack. Every step she took felt heavier, weighed down by exhaustion and the growing fear that they were running out of time. The path they took was rugged and overgrown, cutting through the woods and skirting the edges of a suburban neighborhood. Streetlights flickered in the distance, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward them. "Do you think the airfield is still operational?" Clara asked, breaking the tense silence. "Doubtful," Nate replied. "It's been abandoned for years, but if these guys are using it, they'll have repurposed it for their own needs. We have to be prepared for anything." "Anything like what?" Clara pressed, her voice laced with unease. Nate hesitated. "Weapons, vehicles, maybe even hostages. If they've set up a base there, it means they're planning something big." The thought sent a shiver down Clara's spine. Her father's warning echoed in her mind. Trust no one. They reached the airfield just before dawn. The sprawling complex was a ghost of its former self. Crumbling hangars, rusted fencing, and weeds breaking through the cracked asphalt. But Clara could see signs of recent activity. Fresh tire tracks, footprints in the dirt, and faint lights glowing from one of the hangars. "This is it," Nate whispered. "Let's find a vantage point and figure out what we're dealing with." They climbed to the roof of a dilapidated control tower, careful not to disturb the loose metal and broken glass. From their perch, they had a clear view of the main hangar. Inside, figures moved purposefully, loading crates into black SUVs and motorcycles. Clara squinted, trying to make out the details. "That emblem," she said, pointing. "It's the same flaming wheel the cyclists were wearing." "Which means this isn't just a biker gang," Nate said grimly. "This is an organized operation." As they watched, a man stepped out of the hangar, his commanding presence immediately drawing attention. He barked orders, gesturing toward the vehicles. Clara's breath caught in her throat. "That's him," she whispered. "Who?" Nate asked, following her gaze. "The man in the leather jacket. He was at the train yard," Clara said, her voice trembling. "He called me by my name." Nate frowned. "You recognize him?" Clara shook her head. "No, but he knows me, and that means he knows my father." The man turned, his face illuminated by the dim glow of the hangar lights. Clara gasped. There was something disturbingly familiar about him, something that tugged at the edges of her memory. "I've seen him before," she murmured. "In one of the photos on the USB drive." Nate pulled out the laptop, flipping through the files until he found the image Clara had mentioned. There he was, standing alongside her father in one of the Inferno Network's team photos. "That's Damian Cole," Nate said, his voice low. "He was your father's second in command. If he's here, it means this goes deeper than we thought." Clara's mind raced. If Damian had been part of the Inferno Network, why was he working with the people who had betrayed them? "We need to get closer," she said. "That's a terrible idea," Nate countered. But Clara was already climbing down the tower, her determination outweighing her fear. Nate followed, muttering curses under his breath. They crept toward the hangar, sticking to the shadows. From their new vantage point, they could hear snippets of conversation. "Shipment leaves tonight," one man said. "Damian wants everything in place before the deadline," another added. Clara spotted a crate left unattended near the edge of the hangar. She motioned for Nate to follow her, then darted toward it. Inside the crate were weapons, high-powered rifles, explosives, and tactical gear. Clara's stomach turned. "This isn't just a biker gang," she whispered. "They're preparing for war." Suddenly, a flashlight beam swept across the hangar, stopping just short of where Clara and Nate were hiding. "We've got company," someone shouted. Clara and Nate bolted, weaving between vehicles and crates as shouts erupted around them. A gunshot rang out, the sound piercing the air and sending adrenaline coursing through Clara's veins. They ducked into a side corridor, the narrow space offering temporary cover. Nate pulled out his pistol, his eyes scanning for threats. "We need to split up," he said. "I'll draw them away while you get back to the control tower. If I'm not back in 15 minutes, you go." "No," Clara said firmly. "I'm not leaving you." "You don't have a choice," Nate replied. "If they catch both of us, this ends here. Go." Before Clara could protest, Nate stepped into the open, firing a warning shot that sent their pursuers scattering. Clara's heart raced as she sprinted toward the control tower. The echoes of gunshots and shouts filled the air, each one a reminder of how close she was to losing everything. Every step she took felt like it could be her last, but there was no turning back now. Nate's plan to create a diversion was their best shot. The chaos he was causing would give Clara the time she needed to regroup, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The shadows seemed to shift around her, the trees whispering warnings in the wind. She reached the control tower, gasping for breath, and slipped inside. The room was empty, save for the remnants of old equipment and papers scattered across the floor. Clara quickly scanned the area, looking for something, anything that could help them. As Clara moved through the room, she noticed a dusty filing cabinet in the corner. It seemed out of place in the otherwise barren space. She opened it cautiously, the metal squeaking as she pulled out a stack of files. They were old, the edges frayed, but the names printed on the top of each document made her blood run cold. There, in black and white, were the names of several high-ranking officials, government officials, military commanders, and powerful businessmen. All of them were connected to the Inferno Network. But there was something even more chilling. At the bottom of each file was a note. Damian Cole was the key. He betrayed them all. Clara's stomach twisted. If Damian had been involved in her father's betrayal, then he had played a far deeper role than she had ever imagined. Her mind spun with questions. Why would he turn on them? What did he stand to gain? Clara's fingers trembled as she flipped through the pages, trying to piece together what she had just discovered. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps broke her concentration. She froze, holding her breath. The door to the tower creaked open, and Clara's pulse quickened. It was Damian. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room with an eerie calmness. Clara could see the same cold calculation in his gaze that she had seen in the surveillance footage of the Inferno network. His presence sent a chill down her spine. "So," Damien said, his voice smooth and almost predatory, "you found my little secret." Clara stood her ground, her hand reaching for the gun tucked into her waistband. "Why, Damien?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear that clawed at her chest. "Why betray my father? He trusted you." Damien let out a low laugh, his expression almost pitying. "Trust is a luxury, Clara. Your father may have believed in loyalty, but loyalty doesn't pay the bills. I made my choice long ago." He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "And now, it's your turn to make a choice. You can join me, or you can watch everything you've ever known burn to the ground." Clara's grip on her gun tightened. "You're a traitor, Damien. Whatever you're planning, I'll stop you." Damien's lips curled into a smile. "That's what I like about you, Clara. You're stubborn." He paused, studying her. "But stubbornness only gets you so far. I've already won. You're just too blind to see it." Clara felt a surge of anger rise within her. "You're wrong. I'm not like you." Damien's smile faded. "No, you're exactly like me." He took another step forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "You'll realize that soon enough. We all do." For a moment, neither of them moved. The tension in the air was thick, like a storm ready to break. Clara knew that she couldn't let him talk his way out of this. She had to act. In the split second that followed, she lunged. Damien was quick, too quick. He grabbed her wrist, twisting it and forcing her to drop the gun. Clara stumbled back, gasping for air as pain shot through her arm. "You think you can take me down?" Damien sneered. "You're just a scared little girl playing at something she doesn't understand." Clara's mind raced. She had to get out, had to find Nate. If Damien was right, if he truly had all the power, then they were both as good as dead. But she couldn't give up. Not now. In one swift movement, Clara kicked out, catching Damien off guard and sending him stumbling backward. She didn't wait for him to recover. She ran. Clara raced down the stairs, hearing Damien's voice call after her, but she didn't stop. She burst through the door and out into the yard, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The motorcycles were still there, their engines revving in the distance. Clara's eyes darted to the far side of the airfield. If she could reach the perimeter, maybe, just maybe, she could escape. But as she sprinted toward the fence, the sound of boots pounding behind her sent a fresh wave of panic through her. Damien wasn't far behind. Clara spotted an open vehicle, a jeep, parked a few yards away, its engine running. Without hesitation, she dove into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind her. She turned the key, her heart pounding in her chest. The engine roared to life. Just as Clara was about to speed off, she saw a figure running toward her from the far side of the airfield. It was Nate. He was alive. "Nate!" Clara shouted, relief flooding her chest. She slammed the accelerator to the floor, the jeep lurching forward. But as she reached him, she saw the flash of movement. Damien had caught up, and he wasn't alone. Several of the cyclists were closing in on them. "Nate, get in!" Clara screamed. Nate didn't hesitate. He jumped into the passenger seat, and Clara threw the jeep into gear, speeding away from the airfield. Clara's hands gripped the steering wheel as the jeep hurtled down the rough, winding road. The engine roared, its tires skimming over the uneven ground, and every bump jolted them further from safety. Behind them, the sound of motorcycle engines grew louder. They were being chased again. "Hold on," Clara said through gritted teeth. "We have to lose them, or we won't make it." Nate was scanning the rearview mirror, his eyes hard and focused. "They're closing in," he said, his voice tense. "We need to take a turn up ahead if we want to lose them." Clara nodded and veered the jeep to the right, ignoring the harsh screech of the tires as they slid over gravel. The road ahead narrowed into a more forested area, the trees thick and close together, providing a brief glimmer of hope that they might be able to hide. But they couldn't outrun the motorcycles forever. Clara's heart raced. The only chance they had was to make it to a safer location, somewhere they could regroup and figure out their next move. As Clara pushed the jeep faster, her mind raced. She had a plan, but it was risky. There was an old abandoned barn a few miles up the road, a place her father had mentioned in one of his files. It was a potential safe house, a spot he had used when he needed to lay low. If we can make it there, we might have a chance, Clara said, more to herself than to Nate. Nate's gaze never wavered from the mirror. Then we need to lose them now, or we'll never get there. Clara gritted her teeth and floored the pedal, sending the Jeep lurching forward. The sound of the motorcycles grew louder, but she didn't dare look back. She could feel the heat of pursuit, the pressure mounting with every second that passed. But then, just as they were nearing the turnoff to the barn, Clara heard a loud bang. A shot fired, probably from one of the cyclists trying to slow them down. She swerved, narrowly missing a tree as the Jeep bounced across the road. "We're not going to make it," Clara muttered, her eyes wild with panic. "They're too close." Nate's jaw clenched. "Hold on tight." With one hand on the wheel and the other on the gearshift, Clara was still calculating her options. There was a fork in the road just ahead, one path leading straight ahead, the other veering off to the left through a thick patch of woods. If they stayed on the main road, they'd be an easy target. But if they took the wooded path, they'd risk getting lost or stuck in the overgrowth. "Which way?" Nate asked urgently, as the sound of revving engines grew louder, the bikers closing in. Clara's mind raced. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. If they went left, they'd have the advantage of cover, but they'd have no idea where it led. If they went right, they could get to the barn faster, but the bikers would be able to follow them directly. "We're taking the woods," she said, her voice sharp with resolve. "Hold on." She swerved left, sending the Jeep lurching into the forest path. The trees loomed above them, their branches reaching out like twisted arms, blocking out much of the moonlight. The Jeep jolted and rattled as it bounced over rocks and uneven terrain, the wheels skimming over thick roots and patches of mud. Clara gritted her teeth, pushing the vehicle forward with everything she had. The sound of the motorcycles grew fainter, until it suddenly stopped. Clara dared to look over at Nate. "Did they stop?" she asked, barely believing it. Nate's expression was tense. "No, they're still there. Just taking longer to catch up. But we've got a minute, maybe two." Clara pushed harder, navigating the twisting trail with increasing urgency. But the further they went, the harder it became to see through the dense forest. The headlights of the Jeep barely penetrated the thick brush, and every now and then, Clara had to dodge fallen trees or sharp turns. Then, suddenly, the Jeep lurched to a halt. "What the?" Clara gasped, her heart stopping for a moment as the wheels got stuck on a hidden rock. "We're stuck," Nate muttered. "This is it. We're trapped." The motorcycles were almost on top of them now. Clara could hear the roar of the engines, the hum of the bikes getting closer by the second. There was no more time to run. "Clara," Nate said urgently, his voice low, "we have to fight back. They're not going to stop until we're dead." Clara's eyes darted around, and then she spotted it. A thick branch, sharp and sturdy, lying just off to the side of the road. It was the only weapon they had. Without hesitation, she jumped out of the Jeep, grabbing the branch and raising it in front of her like a spear. Nate followed suit, pulling out his gun. "We're not going down without a fight," Clara said, her voice filled with determination. The first cyclist appeared around the bend, his headlights cutting through the trees. Clara's grip on the branch tightened. "Get ready," she whispered to Nate. The sound of the motorcycles grew louder, echoing through the dense forest as the bikers closed in. Clara's pulse hammered in her chest, but she stood tall, the thick branch in her hands, ready to defend herself. Nate, his gun gripped tightly in his hands, stood beside her, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The lead biker, a tall man in a dark helmet, emerged from the shadows of the trees. His bike roared like a beast on the hunt, its headlights blinding Clara for a moment. He was followed by two others, each of them dressed in black leather, their faces obscured behind tinted visors. "Get ready," Clara muttered to Nate, her voice steady but strained. Nate didn't respond. He just nodded, his focus unbroken. The lead biker revved his engine, circling them slowly, sizing them up. Clara could feel the heat of the motorcycle's engine as it came closer. The rider's gaze locked on her. "Thought you could outrun us, did you?" the lead biker called out, his voice muffled through his helmet. "This is your last chance. Surrender now, and maybe we'll go easy on you." Clara's grip tightened on the branch, her knuckles white. She knew he was trying to get into her head, to make her doubt herself. But she couldn't afford to do that now. She had no choice but to fight. "We'll never surrender," Clara said, her voice firm, filled with resolve. "You'll have to kill us to stop us." The biker's laugh was cold, a sharp contrast to the tension that filled the air. "That can be arranged." He motioned to the other two bikers, and they revved their engines, getting ready to charge. Clara's heart pounded as she positioned herself, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. She glanced at Nate. His face was a mask of concentration, his eyes alert, but she could see the worry in the tightness of his jaw. The first biker lunged forward, his bike roaring as it sped toward Clara. Without thinking, she swung the branch in a wide arc, connecting with the front wheel of the bike. The impact sent the biker flying off his bike, his body crashing into the ground with a sickening thud. Clara didn't hesitate. She turned to face the next one. The second biker swerved to avoid the fallen rider, but Clara was already moving, dashing forward with surprising speed. She slammed the end of the branch into the side of his bike, knocking him off balance. He barely managed to stay upright, but the damage was done. He lost control for a moment, veering off course. Before Clara could make her next move, the third biker surged forward, aiming his bike straight at her. This one was faster, more experienced. Clara could see the determination in his eyes as he revved his engine and charged. But just as the biker was about to crash into her, Nate fired a shot. The bullet zipped through the air, grazing the biker's arm. The man screamed in pain, veering away just in time. Clara didn't wait for him to recover. She launched herself forward, using the distraction to her advantage. She swung the branch once more, hitting the biker's bike with full force. The bike jerked to the side, the rider losing control and crashing into the dirt. Clara's adrenaline was pumping, her every instinct screaming to keep fighting. But she knew they couldn't stay here forever. The sounds of the battle had likely attracted more attention, and if they didn't move quickly, they would be surrounded. "Nate!" she shouted. "We need to go now." Nate was already moving, his gun still aimed at the last remaining biker, who had just regained his balance and was getting ready for another charge. But Clara knew they didn't have time to finish him off. "Nate, we have to move now," she repeated, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the Jeep. Nate hesitated for a moment, then followed her lead. The two of them ran toward the vehicle, jumping inside as the sound of the last biker's engine revved behind them. "Clara, get us out of here," Nate barked. Clara didn't need any more prompting. She slammed the Jeep into gear and sped forward, kicking up dirt and gravel as they raced down the narrow forest trail. The Jeep tore through the forest, the tires skidding as Clara navigated the treacherous path. Behind them, the remaining biker wasn't giving up. His engine roared like a beast, its growl vibrating through the night air. Clara's mind raced. They couldn't outrun him forever. Not on this path. She needed to find a way to lose him, and fast. Up ahead, the road opened up slightly, giving her a brief glimpse of what looked like a small creek crossing. If she could make it there, the rough terrain might slow the biker down enough for them to escape. "Hold on tight," Clara warned, steering the Jeep toward the crossing. The water was deep enough to cause the Jeep to jolt as they hit it, but Clara kept her foot on the gas, plowing through the rushing stream. The tires splashed wildly as the Jeep lurched across the creek. Behind them, the biker hesitated at the edge of the creek, clearly unsure if he could follow them through the water. Clara's heart raced as she watched him slow down, trying to navigate the shifting terrain. "Come on," she whispered, urging the Jeep forward. Just as they reached the other side of the creek, Clara glanced in the rearview mirror. The biker had turned back. He wasn't coming after them anymore. They were free, at least for now. Clara slammed on the brakes as they left the creek behind, pulling the Jeep to a halt on the edge of a small clearing. Her hands were still trembling from the fight, but for the first time in what felt like hours, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. Nate let out a sigh of relief and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. "We did it," he said, his voice a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. But Clara wasn't finished yet. The escape had been a close call, but there were still too many questions left unanswered. Damien was out there, and the truth about her father's betrayal was still hanging over her head. "We need to figure out where we go from here," Clara said, her voice determined. "We can't stop now. We're not safe yet." The sound of the rushing creek faded as Clara parked the jeep just beyond the clearing. The moonlight bathed the landscape in a ghostly glow, casting long shadows across the trees. They were safe, for now, but Clara knew it wouldn't last. She could feel the weight of what was ahead, the unanswered questions that loomed like dark clouds over her every step. Nate had already begun scanning the surroundings, his gun still in hand, as if the danger was waiting just around the corner. He was on edge, his eyes darting back and forth between the trees. Clara knew he wasn't just worried about the bikers. They had been through too much together for that. It was something deeper. "Do you think they'll come after us?" Nate asked, breaking the silence. Clara didn't hesitate. "They will. Damien won't stop until he gets what he wants." "Damien?" Nate repeated, his voice tinged with frustration. "I still don't get it. Why would your father work with him? What's the connection?" Clara's heart clenched. The same question had been running through her mind since she first discovered her father's hidden files. Damien's betrayal was a dark thread in her father's past, but she couldn't yet piece it all together. "I don't know," Clara admitted, the vulnerability in her voice unfamiliar but real. "But I'm going to find out. I have to." She opened the Jeep's glove compartment and pulled out the folder, the file her father had left behind, the one that contained everything she needed to understand. The papers were old, the edges worn and frayed. She flipped through them, her eyes scanning the pages quickly but with a deep sense of urgency. There were names, lots of names, people she didn't recognize, organizations, places. Her father's handwriting filled the margins, scribbled notes and annotations that didn't make sense at first glance. But one name stood out to her, Damien Hawk. Clara's fingers froze on the page. There it was again. The man who had been after her father. Her entire life, her father had kept her away from this world, from the shadows he'd been part of. Now, everything was falling apart. "This is it," Clara murmured, her eyes scanning the page. "Damien, he's not just some criminal. He's part of a bigger network, an international syndicate." Nate leaned in closer, his brow furrowing. "So, your father was working with them? Helping them?" Clara shook her head. "I don't think so. It looks like my father was investigating them. But he was getting too close to something he wasn't supposed to. Damien must have found out." Nate's voice grew tense. "And that's why they came after you? Because your father knew too much?" Clara nodded, her mind racing. Her father hadn't just been involved in some petty crime or corruption. He had been uncovering something far darker, something that could unravel everything. And now, Damien was using her to get the information her father had taken to the grave. Clara slammed the file shut, the reality of the situation settling in her gut like a heavy stone. "We need to go to where this started," she said. "There's a place in these files. My father's last lead. It's the key to everything." Nate looked at her with skepticism. "You really think we'll find answers there?" Clara didn't answer right away. The truth was, she wasn't sure. But she had no choice. She had to follow her father's trail to its end. If she didn't, Damien would win. "We don't have a choice," she said finally. "If we don't go now, they'll find us again, and we won't be ready. We need to stay one step ahead." Nate gave a short nod, understanding the gravity of her words. Clara started the engine, the sound of the Jeep's growl filling the silence. As they pulled away from the clearing and back onto the road, she felt a sense of unease wash over her. She wasn't just running from Damien now. She was chasing after the answers that would reveal the true nature of the man who had been her father. And she knew that once those answers were uncovered, there would be no turning back. As the Jeep sped through the darkened landscape, Clara kept her focus on the road ahead. The moonlight danced on the pavement, but it offered little comfort. Every mile that passed felt like one closer to a truth she might not be able to handle. She glanced at Nate, who had pulled out his map again, studying the locations her father had written down. "There's a small town up ahead," he said, his voice serious. "That's where your father's last lead is. It's not far from here." Clara nodded, her heart racing. This was it. The place her father had been heading before everything fell apart. The place that might hold the key to stopping Damien once and for all. She pushed the jeep faster, the distance between them and the unknown narrowing. The road ahead started to get rougher, the asphalt giving way to dirt paths and rocky terrain. Clara's grip on the wheel tightened. "We're almost there," she muttered to herself. Suddenly, the jeep lurched, the engine sputtering as it lost power. Clara's eyes widened in alarm. "No, not now," she whispered. Nate immediately pulled out his flashlight, scanning the dashboard. "It's the fuel line," he said grimly. "We're not going anywhere unless we fix this." Clara let out a frustrated breath. They were stuck in the middle of nowhere, with no way to get to the town they needed to reach. The sound of their engine failing echoed in the silence, and Clara's sense of dread deepened. "This is bad," she said, her voice tight. "We can't afford to be stranded here. Not with Damien and his people hunting us." Nate stared out the window, his eyes narrowing. "We've got to fix this somehow, but I'm afraid we're not alone anymore." Clara turned her gaze to the rearview mirror and saw it. A set of headlights creeping toward them from a distance. The headlights in the rearview mirror grew brighter, casting an eerie glow on the darkened road. Clara's heart skipped a beat. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. Whoever was behind them wasn't trying to hide. The engine of their vehicle roared as it grew closer. Nate was already out of the jeep, his gun in hand. "We don't have much time," he muttered, scanning the trees. Clara's pulse quickened as she scrambled to gather her thoughts. "We're trapped," she whispered, her voice a mixture of fear and frustration. The engine was dead, and the only way out was to make a run for it, or face whatever was coming. The headlights flickered momentarily, then came into full view. A black SUV with tinted windows, its tires kicking up dust as it sped toward them. Clara's instinct screamed at her to hide, but there was no time. The only option was to confront whatever, or whoever, was coming for them. The SUV screeched to a halt just a few feet from the jeep. The headlights illuminated the night, casting long shadows across the gravel road. Clara's hand instinctively moved to the small knife she had kept hidden in her jacket, but before she could make a move, the door of the SUV swung open. Out stepped a tall figure, clad in a long coat that billowed around him. He wasn't dressed like any of Damien's men. He had the air of someone who wasn't afraid of the dark, who knew how to move quietly and efficiently. His face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but Clara could make out a faint scar on his chin as he stepped forward. "Clara Smith," the man called, his voice low and steady. It was a voice that held authority. Clara froze. He knew her name. That couldn't be good. Nate, on alert, stepped forward, his gun raised. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice sharp. The man didn't flinch. "My name is Marcus," he said coolly. "I'm not here to hurt you." "How do you know my name?" Clara asked, her voice trembling slightly, though she fought to keep it steady. Marcus chuckled darkly, the sound a mixture of amusement and bitterness. "I know a lot more than that, Clara. I've been watching you." Clara took a step back, her mind racing. She didn't like the sound of that. "What do you want?" Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked past her at the jeep, then at Nate. "You're in danger," he said, his tone suddenly serious. "Damien's men are already on their way. If you stay here, you'll be caught. You don't want that." Clara exchanged a quick look with Nate. She could tell from the look in his eyes that he wasn't sure if they should trust this man. Neither was Clara. "And why should we trust you?" Nate asked, his voice taut. Marcus smiled slightly, his eyes flicking to the gun still in Nate's hand. "Because, if I wanted you dead, you'd already be dead. I'm trying to help you." Clara didn't lower her guard. "Help us? You've been watching us. For how long?" Marcus took a slow step forward, as if calculating his next words carefully. "Long enough to know that you're in way over your head. Damien's after something, and it's bigger than you or your father. You're a pawn in a much larger game." Clara's chest tightened. She had suspected as much, but hearing it from this stranger's mouth made it real. "Then what do you suggest we do?" Nate asked, his eyes narrowing. "I can get you out of here," Marcus said simply. "But you have to trust me." Clara hesitated. Everything in her told her to run, to escape, to keep moving forward and uncover the truth on her own. But the cold reality of the situation hit her. They were trapped, and if what Marcus said was true, they didn't have the time to be picky about who they trusted. She glanced at Nate. "All right," Clara said, her voice steady, though her mind was still whirling. "We'll listen, but if you try anything—" "You'll be the first to know," Marcus interrupted smoothly, his gaze never leaving her. Without another word, Marcus gestured toward the SUV. "We don't have time to waste. Damien's men are closing in fast. They'll be here any minute." Clara exchanged a final glance with Nate, who nodded. The decision had been made. They climbed into the back of the SUV, and Marcus slammed the door shut behind them. Clara couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled in her stomach. The night was thick with tension, and despite the sense of relief that they were leaving the Jeep behind, there was no safety in this situation. The SUV sped down the winding road, the tires crunching over the gravel as Marcus navigated through the woods with practiced ease. Clara watched through the back window as the lights from their Jeep faded into the distance, swallowed up by the darkness. For a long time, no one spoke. Clara could hear Nate's breath, steady but deep, beside her. It was almost as if they were trying to piece together their next move. But there were too many unanswered questions. "Where are we going?" Clara finally asked, breaking the silence. Marcus glanced at her briefly in the rearview mirror. "To a place where you'll be safe for now. But this is just the beginning, Clara. The real battle is just ahead." The SUV turned onto a dirt path that led deeper into the forest. The trees closed in around them, casting shadows across the narrow trail. Clara could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, the suffocating sense that everything was spiraling beyond her control. Marcus seemed to sense her growing unease. "Your father wasn't just investigating Damien," he said suddenly, his voice calm yet filled with a quiet intensity. "He was trying to stop something much bigger. A conspiracy that stretches across continents, into the highest circles of power." Clara's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "He was close to exposing it," Marcus continued. "Damien, your father. They were both tangled in it. But your father pulled away. He knew the risk, and he made sure you were kept out of it. But now, it's all coming to light. You have no idea what your father was truly involved in." Clara's mind spun. Her father, the man she had always known as protective and caring, had been part of something far darker than she could have ever imagined. Was this the reason he had kept her at a distance from his work? Was this why he had left the files behind, knowing someone, perhaps Marcus, would eventually come to finish what he had started? "I need to know everything," Clara said, her voice filled with a mixture of determination and fear. "I need to understand what my father was fighting against." Marcus gave her a somber look. "You will. But first, you need to survive what's coming. There's no turning back now." The forest around them grew denser as the SUV navigated the winding path, the shadows of the trees looming like silent sentinels. Clara sat in the back seat, her mind racing with the information Marcus had just revealed. Her father, a man she had always admired, was involved in something far more dangerous than she could ever have imagined. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but they only seemed to create more questions. Nate's gaze never left Marcus, his hand resting on his gun, though his grip had loosened slightly. The man in front of them, Marcus, was an enigma, a stranger with an unsettling calm that made Clara uneasy. But in this world of uncertainty, he was the only lead they had. After what felt like hours, the SUV came to a stop at the edge of a clearing. In the center was a small cabin, its lights flickering through the curtains like a beacon. Clara's heart skipped a beat. "Is this where we're staying?" she asked, her voice edged with skepticism. Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable. "For now, this place is off the radar. It's the safest spot for miles." Clara studied the cabin, feeling the weight of the situation. This small, secluded place was the closest they had to safety. But for how long? How much time did they really have before Damien and his men found them? We'll need to move quickly, Marcus continued. Damien won't rest until he's tracked you down. His network is vast, and he'll stop at nothing to get what he wants. Clara's thoughts flashed to her father's last words, the cryptic warning that had haunted her ever since. If anything happens to me, go to the cabin. Trust no one but Marcus. It all made sense now. Her father had known something was coming, something deadly. He had prepared for it in ways Clara hadn't fully understood until now. The cabin was modest, with a simple kitchen and a few rooms that had clearly been lived in for a long time. The air was thick with the scent of wood and dust, and Clara couldn't help but feel a sense of isolation as they stepped inside. Marcus led them to a small room at the back, where a table stacked with maps and papers sat under a dim light. "This is where your father was working," he said, gesturing to the mess of documents. Clara's heart raced as she approached the table. Her father's handwriting was everywhere. Notes, annotations, coordinates. The papers were a labyrinth of secrets, one that only he had fully understood. "Your father's investigation wasn't just about Damien," Marcus said, his voice low. "He was uncovering a web of corruption that spans the globe. Damien's syndicate is just a small part of it. There's a much larger organization behind everything, one with powerful connections everywhere." Clara took a deep breath. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking into an abyss of deception and power. "How do you know all this?" she asked. Marcus's gaze darkened. "Because I've been involved with them. But I left. Your father didn't. He was different. He wanted to expose them, bring everything to light. But people like Damien, they won't let that happen." Clara's head spun. She had always believed her father to be a man of integrity, someone who did the right thing. But now, the truth was far more complex. "Who is behind this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Marcus looked away for a moment, as if considering how much to reveal. "I don't have all the names yet, but I know that whoever they are, they're untouchable. They control everything: governments, corporations, media. They pull the strings, and Damien is just their puppet." Clara's stomach churned. The conspiracy her father had been trying to expose wasn't just about money or power. It was about control on a global scale. As Clara sifted through the papers, one document caught her eye. It was a map of locations, each marked with a red circle. Some of the names she recognized, cities she'd visited as a child with her father. Others, she didn't. "These places," Clara muttered, pointing to the map. "What do they mean?" Marcus leaned over her shoulder, his fingers brushing the paper as he studied the map. "Your father's last lead. These are key locations, places where the syndicate has been operating. But there's one place that stands out." He tapped a circle on the map. "This one. It's a facility hidden deep in the mountains. That's where the real power lies." Clara's heart raced. "What's there?" "Damien's real goal. Whatever your father found out, it's all tied to this facility. But getting there isn't going to be easy. There are layers of security, and even I don't know exactly what you'll find when you get there." Clara's mind was working in overdrive. This was it, the place her father had been heading before everything fell apart. The place that could hold the answers to everything. "You're telling me this is where it all started?" she asked, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and determination. Marcus nodded. "Your father was close to uncovering it all, but he couldn't do it alone. That's why he sent you. You're the key to finishing what he started." Clara stood up, her hands trembling. Everything was coming together. The map, the documents, the warning. It was all leading to one place. "We have to go there," she said firmly. "We can't waste any more time. Damien's going to come after us, and we need to get ahead of him." Marcus nodded, already grabbing his jacket. "I'll prepare the car. But know this, Clara, the journey ahead won't be easy. They'll stop at nothing to keep you from the truth. And even if we make it to that facility, we may not survive what we find there." Clara looked at Nate, who gave her a silent nod of agreement. They didn't have a choice. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady. The SUV rumbled down the winding road, its tires kicking up dust and gravel in the dark of night. Clara's heart was heavy with the weight of what she had learned, what her father had been involved in, and the path she was now on. There was no turning back. She could feel it in her bones. Whatever awaited her at the facility was far more dangerous than anything she had faced so far. And yet, there was a part of her that couldn't help but feel that this was the only way to honor her father's legacy. Marcus had been silent since they left the cabin, his eyes focused on the road ahead, his expression grim. Clara and Nate sat in the back, both lost in their own thoughts. The uncertainty of what was to come loomed large, and no one spoke a word as the miles slipped by in the dark. An hour into their drive, Clara's phone buzzed in her pocket. She jumped, startled by the sudden vibration. She fished it out, her fingers trembling slightly as she saw the unknown number flashing on the screen. "Who is it?" Nate asked, his eyes flicking toward her as she hesitated, staring at the phone. Clara didn't know, but something told her it wasn't a call she should ignore. "Hello?" she answered, her voice tight. "Clara," a familiar voice said on the other end. "It's Damien." Her stomach dropped at the sound of his voice. She had expected him to be after her, but hearing his voice now made it all feel even more real. The danger wasn't just looming, it was here. "Damien," Clara said, trying to keep her voice steady. "What do you want?" There was a chuckle from the other end of the line. "What I want is simple. You're digging where you shouldn't be, Clara. You're asking questions you can't afford to ask. You're putting yourself and those you care about in harm's way." Clara's hand tightened around the phone, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I don't care what you want, Damien. I'm going to find the truth, and there's nothing you can do to stop me." "Ah, the naive courage of a child trying to play with fire," Damien replied. His voice was cold, dripping with contempt. "You have no idea what you're up against. Your father didn't either. But you'll find out soon enough. Just don't say I didn't warn you." The line went dead. Clara stared at the phone, her pulse racing. Damien had just threatened her, and she knew he wasn't kidding. He had the resources, the power, and the ruthlessness to make good on his promises. But that only made her more determined. "Damien knows we're coming," she said, turning to Marcus. "He's already on to us." Marcus glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his eyes hard. "That's not surprising. But we still have the advantage. He doesn't know exactly what you found, and he doesn't know where we're going. He's in the dark about that. For now, we need to keep it that way." Clara nodded. She wasn't sure how much of an advantage they had left, but for the moment, that would have to be enough. The terrain began to change as they drove deeper into the mountains. The road became narrower, winding through dense forests, with sheer cliffs on one side and steep drops on the other. The silence in the car was palpable, broken only by the soft hum of the engine and the occasional crackling of static on the radio. After a while, Marcus slowed the SUV, his eyes scanning the area. They were nearing their destination, the facility her father had uncovered. She could feel the tension building, the weight of the unknown pressing down on them. Clara had never felt more out of place, more exposed, than she did in this moment. She glanced out the window, her gaze lingering on the shadowy trees. She had no idea what lay ahead, but the urgency of the situation was undeniable. They had no time to waste. Finally, the SUV came to a stop in front of an imposing steel gate. It loomed in the dark like the entrance to a prison, its heavy metal bars stretching high above them. A camera perched on the gate, its lens reflecting the headlights of the vehicle. Marcus got out first, his movements deliberate. "Stay here," he said, his tone firm. "I'll check the perimeter. Don't do anything until I say so." Clara and Nate exchanged a look, but neither of them questioned Marcus. They trusted him, for now. Minutes ticked by in silence. The air felt thick, and Clara's heart raced. Every noise seemed amplified. The wind rustling the leaves, the distant call of an owl, the rhythmic beat of her own pulse in her ears. Suddenly, Marcus reappeared, his face grim. "We're not the only ones here," he said quietly. "There's someone watching us." Clara's stomach churned. "Damien?" she asked. "No. Worse. Someone from the inside." Marcus's gaze hardened. "We have to move fast." Without another word, he led them through a small gap in the fence, and they crept silently toward the facility. The building loomed ahead, a massive concrete structure with few windows and towering walls. It looked abandoned, desolate, but Clara could sense the danger lurking in its shadows. They reached the back entrance, where Marcus quickly disabled the security system. Clara's heart pounded as she followed him through a narrow hallway, lit only by flickering fluorescent lights overhead. The place felt cold, sterile, as if it had been forgotten by time, but Clara knew it hadn't. "This way," Marcus whispered, gesturing to a door at the end of the hallway. The door opened to a large room, filled with rows of metal shelves stacked high with documents, files, and equipment. Clara couldn't help but notice the massive computer terminal at the far side of the room, its screen glowing with static. Marcus crossed the room and approached the terminal, typing something into the keyboard. The screen flickered for a moment, and then a map appeared, one that made Clara's blood run cold. "This is it," Marcus said, pointing to the map. "This is where everything connects. Your father was right about this place. It's the heart of the operation." Clara stepped forward, her hands trembling as she studied the map. There were locations marked, hidden facilities all over the world, places connected by a vast network of power and influence. But one location stood out, its circle glowing brighter than the others. It was a location Clara recognized, the same place her father had been heading before everything had fallen apart. "Your father was close," Marcus said, his voice low. "This is where it all ends. If we can get to this place, we can shut it all down." Clara's mind raced as she stared at the map. This was the moment. The truth was within reach, but they weren't the only ones who knew it. Damien's men were closing in, and they had no more time to waste. The air was thick with tension as Clara stared at the map, her mind racing. The facility's location, marked with a glowing red dot, was too familiar, too significant. It was the place her father had been heading, the place that held the answers, the truth she had been searching for. Marcus was at the terminal, his fingers flying over the keyboard, but Clara couldn't tear her eyes away from the map. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a precipice, staring into the abyss. Every instinct told her to turn back, but she couldn't. Not now. Not when she was so close. "What's the next step?" Nate's voice broke through her thoughts, bringing her back to the present. Marcus looked over at them, his expression grim. "We need to get to this facility," he said, pointing to the marked location. "But it's not going to be easy. The entire area is locked down. There are layers of security we'll need to bypass." Clara's stomach tightened. She had heard of places like this, off-the-grid facilities built to house secrets too dangerous to be exposed. But this place was different. It was the heart of a global operation, and she had no idea what they would find when they got there. "We don't have much time," Marcus continued. "Damien's men will be on us the moment they realize we're here. We need to move fast." Clara nodded, feeling the weight of the situation press down on her. There was no turning back. Her father's legacy was in her hands now, and the truth was within reach. But so were the enemies who would stop at nothing to keep it buried. They moved quickly, the tension palpable as they left the room and made their way to the facility's back exit. The hallways were eerily quiet, the only sound the soft echo of their footsteps on the concrete floor. Clara could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her senses on high alert. Every shadow seemed to conceal a threat. Every creak of the building felt like a warning. Marcus led the way, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, ever watchful. Clara followed closely behind, her hand resting on the grip of her gun, though she hadn't used it yet. Nate brought up the rear, his posture tense and ready for action. They reached the back door, which opened into a small, overgrown yard. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. For a moment, it felt almost peaceful, too peaceful. But Clara knew better. This was the calm before the storm. "Stay low," Marcus instructed, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're not alone out here." Clara nodded, following his lead as they moved quickly through the yard and toward the tree line. They had to cover miles of rough terrain before they could even begin to think about accessing the facility's main entrance. The forest around them was dense, the trees thick and towering, blocking out much of the moonlight. Clara could barely make out the shapes of the others in the dark, but she could hear their breathing, steady, controlled. She focused on her steps, keeping her eyes trained on the ground in front of her. As they moved deeper into the woods, Clara's thoughts began to race again. The facility, her father's involvement, Damien. It was all coming together in a way that both terrified and exhilarated her. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture that was emerging was one she wasn't sure she could face. Suddenly, Marcus held up his hand, signaling for them to stop. He crouched low, his eyes scanning the darkness. Clara did the same, instinctively reaching for the small flashlight on her belt, but Marcus shook his head. "Stay quiet," he whispered, his voice urgent. "There's something ahead." Clara strained her ears, trying to catch any sounds that might give away their position. At first, it was just the wind rustling the leaves. But then she heard it, a faint crunching noise, like footsteps on the forest floor. It was too light to be an animal, too deliberate to be random. "They're coming," Marcus said softly, his voice grim. "Damien's men." Clara's pulse quickened. They couldn't afford to be caught out here. They needed to move, and fast. Without warning, gunfire erupted from the darkness, the sharp crack of bullets splitting the air. Clara ducked instinctively, her heart racing. The first shot missed, but the second grazed her arm, sending a sharp pain through her body. She gritted her teeth, suppressing a scream. "Get down," Marcus shouted, pulling her behind a thick tree trunk for cover. Nate had already returned fire, his shots echoing through the forest, but Clara couldn't tell if he had hit anything. The gunfire continued, coming from multiple directions. They were surrounded. "Keep moving," Marcus ordered. "We need to get to higher ground." Clara nodded, gritting her teeth against the pain in her arm. She could feel the blood soaking through her sleeve, but there was no time to worry about it now. They had to get to the facility. The trio sprinted through the trees, dodging bullets and trying to make their way toward the mountains in the distance. The sounds of gunfire followed them, growing louder with each passing second. After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached the base of the mountain. Their pursuers were still on their heels, but Marcus led them to a narrow path that wound up the side of the cliff. It was treacherous, the rocks loose and unstable underfoot, but it was their only chance. The climb was grueling. Clara's breath came in ragged gasps, the pain in her arm making every step feel like an eternity. But she pushed forward, driven by a single thought: get to the top, get to the facility. Behind them, the sound of gunfire had died down, but Clara knew it wasn't over yet. They were still being hunted. "Almost there," Marcus said, his voice strained as he helped Clara over a particularly steep section of the climb. The moonlight broke through the clouds, casting a pale light over the mountain. Clara could see the faint outline of the facility at the top, just visible through the trees. It was within reach. They reached the summit, breathless and exhausted, and made their way toward the facility's entrance. The heavy metal doors loomed ahead, locked and reinforced, but Marcus had anticipated this. He quickly pulled out a small device from his jacket and began working on the lock. Clara could feel the tension building, the weight of what was to come pressing down on her. This was it, the moment of truth. Behind them, the sounds of footsteps grew louder, and Clara's heart raced. Damien's men were closing in. They had no more time. Marcus finished working on the lock, and the doors creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway inside. "Go," Marcus said urgently. "Get inside." Clara and Nate rushed through the door, but as Clara stepped across the threshold, she froze. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Someone was waiting for them. The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening thud, sealing them in the darkness of the facility's interior. Clara's heart hammered in her chest as she scanned the dimly lit hallway. It was silent, the only sound the faint hum of electrical equipment and their own hurried breathing. "Stay alert," Marcus whispered, his hand resting on the grip of his gun as he moved cautiously down the corridor. "We don't know who's waiting for us in here." Clara nodded, her mind racing. Whoever was inside this facility was waiting for them, and it wasn't just Damien's men. They had known too much. The air felt thick with the promise of betrayal, and Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they had walked straight into a trap. They moved down the narrow hall, the concrete walls closing in on them as the lights flickered overhead. Clara's thoughts drifted back to her father, to the man who had uncovered this place, who had gotten too close to the truth. Had he known what would happen to him when he dug deeper? Was this the same fate that awaited her? They rounded a corner, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. Standing at the far end of the hallway, silhouetted in the weak light from a nearby bulb, was a figure. A man. Clara's pulse spiked. Her mind instantly went to Damien. Was this him, waiting for them? But the figure didn't move. He just stood there, watching them with a cold, unblinking stare. Clara couldn't make out his features, but there was something disturbingly familiar about him. Marcus held up a hand, signaling for them to stop. He was tense, his eyes fixed on the stranger. "Stay back," he murmured, his voice low. "I'll handle this." But Clara couldn't stay back. The figure, though still distant, exuded an air of authority, and something told her that this wasn't Damien. Marcus moved forward cautiously, his gun drawn. Nate followed closely behind, but Clara stayed rooted to the spot, her eyes fixed on the figure. She had to know who it was. She had to know why he looked so familiar. The man finally moved, stepping into the light, and Clara froze. It wasn't Damien. It was someone else entirely, someone from her past. "Clara," the man said, his voice soft but steady. He didn't raise a weapon or make any move to attack. Instead, he just stood there, watching her with a mixture of surprise and something else. Regret? "I didn't think you'd make it this far." Clara's mind spun. The voice. The face. It couldn't be. "Ethan," she whispered, disbelief washing over her. The man, Ethan, gave a small, rueful nod. "I never thought I'd see you again, not after everything that happened." Clara took a step forward, her heart racing. "What are you doing here?" The question escaped her before she could stop it. "How do you know about all of this? What's going on, Ethan?" Ethan's eyes flickered briefly to Marcus, then back to Clara. His gaze hardened, his expression taking on a more guarded, almost cold demeanor. "You really don't get it, do you?" He took a step toward her, his tone shifting, becoming more serious. "None of this is what you think. Your father wasn't just some innocent bystander. He was a key player in all of this." Clara's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" she demanded, though part of her was afraid to hear the answer. Ethan sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair as if conflicted. He was part of a much larger operation. The facility, the research, it was all part of a global network. Your father was on the inside, Clara. He was a part of it all, right up until the moment he decided he didn't want to be anymore. Clara's head spun. This couldn't be true. Her father, the man she had idolized, had been involved in something like this? But why? Why didn't he tell me? Clara's voice cracked, the words barely audible. Ethan's expression softened for a moment, as if he regretted what he had to say. He couldn't, Clara. He couldn't afford to tell you. If he had, you would have been targeted just like him. You would have been caught up in something much worse than you can imagine. Clara took a shaky breath, trying to process the flood of information. Then why are you here, Ethan? Why didn't you stop him? Why didn't you stop all of this? Ethan's eyes darkened, his shoulders tensing. Because I was part of it too, Clara. I never wanted you to get involved, but when your father tried to back out, when he started talking about exposing everything, that's when things got dangerous. You have no idea what kind of people we're dealing with here. Clara staggered backward, her hand gripping the wall for support. She couldn't breathe. The man she had once trusted, the man she had loved, he had been a part of this? He had been working with her father, complicit in the very things she had been trying to unravel? I'm sorry, Clara, Ethan said, his voice pained, but now you're in too deep. They'll come for you, just like they did for your father. And I can't protect you anymore. Clara stared at him, her emotions a whirlwind of disbelief, anger, and hurt. You've been lying to me this whole time, Ethan. Everything you told me, everything we shared, it was all a lie? Ethan closed his eyes, as if the weight of his confession was too much to bear. I never wanted to hurt you, but I couldn't walk away from this. I thought you would understand someday. But now you're here, and there's no turning back. Clara's anger surged, her eyes burning with fury. She wanted to scream at him, to demand answers, but her voice caught in her throat. She didn't know what to feel anymore. Betrayal? Loss? Was there any way to reconcile the man she had loved with the man standing before her now? Clara, Marcus said, his voice cutting through the tension. We need to go. Now. Clara turned to look at Marcus, her eyes wide with shock. What do you mean, go? We can't just leave now. But Marcus was already moving, his face set in a determined expression. There's no time. We need to move, or we'll all be dead. Clara barely registered what was happening as Marcus pulled her away, his grip firm around her arm. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, the urgency in his voice snapping her out of her shock. Ethan's right about one thing, Marcus said grimly. You're not safe here, Clara. We have to leave before they trap us inside. Clara glanced back, her gaze meeting Ethan's. He hadn't moved, hadn't tried to stop them. His eyes were filled with regret, but they were also resolute, as if he had already made his choice. Marcus and Clara sprinted down the hallway, Nate close behind. Clara's mind was spinning, the world around her moving too fast. Betrayed by the man she had loved, hunted by people she didn't understand, and with the truth just out of reach. How had everything gone so wrong? Clara's heart raced as she followed Marcus and Nate down the narrow, cold hallway. The weight of Ethan's revelation hung heavy in her chest, his words still echoing in her mind. Her father, part of the operation. Ethan, part of the deception. Everything she had believed in, everything she thought she knew, was being ripped apart before her eyes. The sound of footsteps behind them intensified, and Clara's pulse quickened. They were being pursued. She had no idea who exactly was chasing them, but from the way Marcus moved, she could tell they weren't the only ones with their sights set on escaping the facility. We need to reach the extraction point, Marcus said, his voice low but urgent. There's a way out through the east wing. We'll meet up with the backup team there. Clara nodded, trying to steady her breathing. She couldn't let herself fall apart now, not when everything was on the line. The east wing. She had no idea where that was, but she had no choice but to trust Marcus. His calm demeanor in the midst of chaos was both a comfort and a warning. The corridor seemed to stretch on endlessly, the flickering lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. Clara couldn't help but feel like they were being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every echo in the air made her jump. Whoever was after them knew this place far too well, and the closer they got to their destination, the more she could sense the tightening grip of danger surrounding them. Do you have any idea who's behind this? Clara asked, trying to break the silence and keep her mind off the panic creeping up her spine. Marcus didn't look at her as he kept moving forward, his gaze sharp and focused. It doesn't matter. All that matters is getting you out of here. We'll figure out the rest once we're safe. Clara bit her lip, her mind racing. The longer they ran, the more she felt a sense of dread settling over her. Someone had orchestrated all of this. The disappearance of her father, the attacks, the web of lies. Someone wanted them dead, and the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous things would become. But just as the words formed on the tip of her tongue, they turned another corner, and Marcus halted abruptly, raising his hand in a signal for them to stop. Clara's eyes widened as she saw the darkened doorway at the end of the hall, an unfamiliar light spilling from the cracks under it. It didn't look like an exit. It looked like a trap. Before Clara could react, the door opened with a slow, deliberate creak, revealing a figure standing in the doorway. It wasn't Ethan, this time. It was someone new. A woman, tall and imposing, her dark eyes cold and calculating. Her black, tactical gear blended perfectly with the shadows, and her presence alone was enough to stop Clara in her tracks. "Marcus," the woman said, her voice smooth, almost too calm for the situation. "I wasn't expecting you." Marcus stood rigid, his hand twitching at his side. Clara could see the tension in his posture, the way his muscles tightened. It was clear he knew this woman. More than that, he was afraid of her. "I didn't think you'd be involved," Marcus replied, his voice clipped. "This isn't the time, Emma." Emma smirked, stepping into the hallway. "Oh, but it is. You thought you could just walk away, Marcus? You should know better than that." Clara's eyes flicked between Marcus and Emma, trying to piece together the connection. "Who is she?" she asked, her voice shaking with the weight of the moment. Marcus's gaze briefly flickered toward Clara. She's someone from my past. A mistake? The words stung Clara, but she didn't have time to process them. Emma's eyes narrowed as she turned her attention to Clara, studying her with an unsettling intensity. She's the one, isn't she? Emma said, her voice now colder, more dangerous. The daughter. I should have known. Clara froze. What are you talking about? Emma didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a slow step forward, her gaze locked onto Clara. You don't know, do you? She said, her lips curling into a cruel smile. You don't know who your father really was. You're just another pawn in this game, just like the rest of us. Clara's head spun. Pawn? Was that what she was? A mere piece in someone's twisted chess game? Marcus moved between them, his body tense. Emma, this isn't the way. You don't want to do this. Emma's gaze shifted from Clara back to Marcus. I don't think you understand, Marcus. The game has already been played, and now we're all just waiting for the final move. Clara's mind raced, but before she could speak, Emma continued. Your father was part of something much bigger than you realize. He wasn't just a research scientist. He was one of the key players, one of the architects behind everything you've seen here. And now you're too close to the truth. They've decided that you need to be eliminated. Clara felt the weight of Emma's words hit her like a physical blow. Her father, a key player in some dark, global operation? This was more than just betrayal. This was far-reaching. Too far for Clara to comprehend. Why should I believe you? Clara spat, her anger flaring up. You've been part of this too. What's your game, Emma? What do you want? Emma smiled again, but this time it was colder, more malicious. I'm just a messenger. And you? You're in the way. The people in charge won't let you live now that you've uncovered too much. Before Clara could respond, Marcus stepped forward again, raising his hands in a placating gesture. Listen, Emma, there's no need for this. We can still walk away from this. You and me, we can make it out. Emma laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that echoed down the hallway. You're too naive, Marcus. This isn't about you and me. This is about survival. And you're on the wrong side. Clara's blood ran cold. What does that mean? She asked, her voice trembling. Emma's eyes glinted with cold amusement. It means, Clara, that you don't have much time left. Neither do any of us. In that moment, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor. Someone else was coming. Marcus, his face grim, grabbed Clara's arm and started pulling her away. Run, he shouted, urgency clear in his voice. Clara hesitated for a heartbeat, looking at Emma one last time. But Emma didn't move. She just stood there, watching them. As Marcus yanked Clara down the hallway, she could hear Emma's voice echo behind them, calling out to Marcus, her words sharp and final. You'll never escape. We'll find you. The sound of footsteps behind them was relentless. Clara's chest burned with every breath, her legs aching from the sprint down the winding hallways. She couldn't look back. Not now. Not with the threat of capture so close. But every step she took was weighted by the knowledge that someone, maybe more than one person, was hunting them down. Marcus kept pulling her forward, his grip on her arm tight but reassuring. He was still ahead of her, his eyes scanning every corner as they rushed toward the exit. She could see the emergency lights flickering ahead, casting a dim glow on the door they were heading for. Almost there, Marcus muttered under his breath. But Clara wasn't sure if she could believe him anymore. Not after everything Emma had said. Her mind swirled with questions, doubt creeping into every thought. Who could she trust? Was Marcus really trying to help her, or was he just another player in this dangerous game? Emma had claimed Marcus had a past he wasn't proud of, but then again, who didn't have secrets in a place like this? She wanted to ask him, to demand the truth, but the urgency of their escape made it impossible. The last thing they needed was more questions. They needed a plan, a way out. The emergency exit door loomed closer now, and Clara's heart skipped a beat. Just as they reached the door, Marcus shoved it open with a force that made it bang against the wall. They were outside, free, for the moment. But the world outside wasn't the safe haven Clara had hoped for. It was dark, a vast expanse of woods stretching out before them. A forest, silent and foreboding. It felt like a trap, but there was nowhere else to go. The sound of their pursuers' footsteps had stopped, but that didn't mean they were safe. Clara's gut twisted with the certainty that they were being watched. Marcus scanned the surroundings quickly, and then nodded toward a small, overgrown path leading deeper into the forest. This way. They'll never expect us to take the trail. It leads to a safe house. Clara didn't argue. She followed him into the woods, the damp earth beneath her feet making every step harder. Her mind was still racing. How much time did they have before the facility's security realized they were gone? How long would it take for reinforcements to arrive? As they moved deeper into the trees, Clara's mind kept returning to the same question. Why had Emma said what she did? Was it true that her father had been part of something bigger? Or was Emma just trying to confuse her, to throw her off course? Clara didn't know who to believe anymore. But she did know one thing for certain. She needed answers. And she wasn't going to get them by running forever. The path narrowed as they trudged through the underbrush, the trees above them thick enough to block out most of the moonlight. The air was cool, and the distant sounds of the forest seemed eerily quiet. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves, had Clara's heart racing. "We're almost there," Marcus said, glancing back at her. He was starting to look strained, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. It wasn't just the physical exertion that was wearing on him. There was something in his expression that made Clara uneasy. Guilt, maybe? Or regret. The safe house was hidden well, tucked between two massive oaks, the small cabin camouflaged by the thick foliage around it. As they approached the door, Marcus hesitated for a split second before unlocking it. Clara watched him, her instincts telling her something wasn't right, but she pushed the feeling aside. They had to keep moving forward. Inside, the cabin was small but well-stocked, with a faint smell of must and wood smoke in the air. There were weapons on the wall, and various supplies scattered about. A single bed was tucked into the corner, a table with maps and papers strewn across it. It looked like the kind of place you'd go to lay low, not the kind of place where you'd find comfort or rest. Clara took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She couldn't afford to panic now. They were safe, for the moment. She needed to stay focused, to keep her mind sharp. There was still too much at stake. "Do you have a plan?" Clara asked, her voice low but urgent. "What do we do now?" Marcus was already moving toward the table, rifling through the papers. "We wait," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "We'll lay low for a while, then contact my people. They can get us out of here, take us to a secure location. After that, we'll figure out what's really going on." Clara wasn't sure she liked the sound of that. "What do you mean, your people?" she asked. "Who are they?" Marcus turned to face her, his expression hardening. "People I trust. People who can help us. But it won't be easy. There's no going back from here, Clara. We're in this together now." Clara nodded, her mind racing as she tried to process everything. They were in this together. That meant she had to trust Marcus, at least for now. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more he wasn't telling her. She sat down at the small table, running a hand through her hair, trying to steady herself. "I just want to know the truth," she whispered, more to herself than to Marcus. Marcus seemed to hesitate for a moment, but then he sat down across from her. "I know you do, and you will. But it's not going to be easy. The people behind all this, they're dangerous, and they'll stop at nothing to get what they want. They'll come for us, Clara, and we'll have to be ready." Clara stared at him, a sense of dread settling over her. How could she possibly be ready for something this big? Something that reached far beyond what she could even imagine. But she didn't have time to dwell on it. They were already in too deep. There was no turning back now. The stillness in the cabin was stifling. The low hum of the forest outside seemed distant, as if the world had stopped turning, holding its breath for what was to come. Clara sat across from Marcus, the table between them now a barrier she didn't know how to cross. His words hung in the air like smoke, elusive and dangerous, and the more she thought about them, the more they unraveled the fabric of her reality. "I'll tell you everything," Marcus had said, but Clara could sense his hesitation, the unspoken weight of what he wasn't ready to share. She couldn't keep waiting for the truth. It was suffocating her. "How much more is there, Marcus?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't sure if she was speaking to him or to the vast silence surrounding them. How much more do I need to know before I can trust you? Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, eyes not meeting hers. He had the look of someone who was trying to keep a lid on a storm, but Clara could feel the pressure building, the cracks starting to form. I never meant for this to happen, Clara, he said finally, his voice low. None of it. But there are things you don't understand. Things about your father, about them, that you need to hear. Clara's pulse quickened, her mind already racing with possibilities. Tell me now, she demanded. Who are they? And why does my father matter? Marcus exhaled sharply, rubbing his eyes as if trying to gather his thoughts. Your father wasn't just some scientist. He was one of the few who knew the full extent of the project. The one that all of this mess, is built around. Clara blinked, her breath catching. The project? What project? Marcus's gaze hardened, and he stood up, walking toward the window, as if the answer he was about to give was something that could not be spoken in such close quarters. He looked outside, his expression darkening, before he finally turned back to her. Project Phoenix, he said quietly. It was supposed to change everything. They were trying to create something beyond human. A weapon, an army. They thought they could control it, control us. But it was a mistake. And when your father realized what it was becoming, he tried to stop it. He wanted out, but it was too late. Clara's mind was reeling. Project Phoenix, her father had been involved in that? She had to be mishearing him. Her father, a scientist with a prestigious career, involved in something so monstrous? No, Clara shook her head, the words thick in her throat. That's impossible. My father would never. Your father wasn't a saint, Clara, Marcus interrupted, his voice heavy with truth. He did what he thought was right, but he also made choices that had consequences. He got too close to the heart of the project, and now they want him. They want you too. Clara stood up abruptly, her knees weak. What do you mean, they want me? Because you're the key, Marcus said, his voice tight. They think you're the only one who can finish what your father started. And that makes you a target. The room seemed to spin. Clara's father, her hero, the man she had always trusted, had been tangled in something so sinister. And now she was caught in its web. She couldn't breathe. Clara turned toward the door, a sudden urge to escape, to run far away from this nightmare. But there was nowhere to run. Every door was locked, and every escape led straight back into the hands of the people who were pulling the strings. Marcus's voice stopped her. We don't have time to run anymore, Clara. She turned back to face him, her heart racing. Then what do we do? What the hell are we supposed to do now? Marcus stepped closer, his eyes intense. We fight. We get answers. And we take down the people behind all of this, starting with the ones who are coming for you. Clara's mind swirled, torn between fear and the raw desire to finally have answers. She wasn't sure she could trust Marcus completely, but she had no other choice. You're not the only one who wants answers, Clara said, her voice steady despite the storm raging in her chest. But I need to know everything. I need to know who we're up against, who's really pulling the strings. Marcus nodded slowly. I'll tell you everything I know. But this isn't going to be easy, Clara. There's a price to be paid for digging too deep, and we might not survive the fallout. Clara's resolve hardened. I don't care. I'm not running anymore. After hours of tense conversation, the cabin finally felt like a small island of security amidst the chaos closing in on them. Marcus had revealed more. Names, locations, the web of deception her father had been caught in. But it wasn't enough. They needed more. We'll go to the safe house, Marcus said, his voice low but determined. There's someone there who can help us, someone who knows the next step. Clara didn't hesitate. She had no choice but to trust him. She couldn't sit in this cabin any longer, waiting for the walls to close in. They had to find the people who were behind Project Phoenix, and they had to do it now. As they prepared to leave, Clara's mind kept returning to the puzzle pieces that didn't fit. The words from Emma, the warnings she had received, the cryptic messages her father had left behind. It was all starting to feel like a trap that had been set long before she ever realized it. But there was no time to dwell on the uncertainty. The door creaked open, and they stepped into the night, the woods dark and silent around them. As they walked deeper into the forest, Clara could feel the weight of every decision pressing down on her. This was it. There was no going back now. The woods were dense, but Clara's instincts kicked in as they moved swiftly and silently, following the narrow path that Marcus had memorized. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if they were walking toward something that would change everything, perhaps even their lives. Behind them, the sound of engines started to hum faintly in the distance. The pursuit had begun. Someone was coming for them. Someone who wouldn't stop until they had Clara, and the secrets her father had left behind. With the pursuit closing in, can Clara and Marcus reach the safe house in time? What will they discover about Project Phoenix, and how much danger are they truly in? And who else is involved in the game Clara has been pulled into? The sounds of the forest felt deafening as Clara and Marcus hurried through the trees. Every crack of a twig beneath their feet felt like a warning shot, echoing in the night. Their destination, the so-called safe house, was only a few miles away, but it felt like an eternity as the silence stretched between them. Clara's thoughts raced in tandem with her footsteps. Project Phoenix. She couldn't shake the weight of those words, the chilling implications of what her father had been involved in. What had her father truly known about the project? And why had he tried to stop it? It didn't make sense. The more Marcus revealed, the more tangled the web became. Clara needed clarity, needed answers. But most of all, she needed to stay alive. Beside her, Marcus was focused, his movements precise as he navigated the darkened path with the ease of someone who knew this terrain like the back of their hand. But Clara could see the strain in his posture, the way his jaw clenched with each step. He was running on fumes, just like her. They both were. Almost there, Marcus muttered, his voice hoarse. He didn't look at her, but she could see the flicker of urgency in his eyes. Clara's heart pounded, a mixture of dread and hope bubbling inside her. If they could just get to the safe house, everything might change. But she couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking right into another trap. One mistake, one wrong move, and they could be cornered. It was still dark when they reached the edge of the forest, and the small cabin came into view. Tucked away between two towering oaks, it looked almost too quiet, too perfect. There were no lights on, no signs of life. Just the eerie stillness of a place that had been waiting for them. Marcus signaled for Clara to stop, then motioned toward the door. "Stay close. We don't know who's here." Clara nodded, her pulse quickening again. The sense of being watched had never left her, and now, as they approached the cabin, it only intensified. Marcus was leading them into a place of unknowns, a place that could either be their salvation or their final resting place. He reached for the door, his hand steady as he tested the handle. It was locked, but only for a moment. With a swift motion, he unlocked it, pushing the door open just a crack. The creak of the door echoed in the stillness of the night, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. It was a sound that seemed to signal everything that was about to change. The door opened wider, and Marcus motioned for her to go inside. Clara hesitated for a brief moment, her instincts screaming at her to turn and run. But she had nowhere else to go. She followed Marcus into the cabin. The interior of the cabin was surprisingly warm, lit only by the dim glow of a small lamp in the corner. It was sparse, functional, nothing like the sterile, high-tech environments she'd been in before. The walls were lined with shelves stacked with books and old equipment, and the faint smell of smoke lingered in the air. There was a fireplace in the center of the room, unlit but still casting a faint shadow on the walls. Everything in the cabin had the feel of a place that was meant to be hidden, low profile, off the grid. But Clara wasn't sure if it was because it was supposed to be a refuge, or because it was just a temporary stop in the dangerous game she was caught in. "Stay here," Marcus said, his voice firm. "I'm going to check the perimeter. You need to rest." Clara watched as he disappeared into another room, leaving her alone in the cabin. She felt the weight of the silence settle around her, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to exhale. But even in the safety of the cabin, she couldn't let her guard down. There was always someone watching. She crossed the room slowly, running her fingers over the worn bookshelves. Her thoughts were still heavy with Marcus's revelations. Her father, a key player in something as monstrous as Project Phoenix. It didn't make sense. Was he trying to save people, or had he been complicit in something far darker than Clara had imagined? She needed to find out more, but the questions swirling in her mind were suffocating. The cabin was filled with clues, but Clara couldn't make sense of any of them. Not yet. Suddenly, the sound of a door creaking open from the back of the cabin snapped her from her thoughts. Clara froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She didn't know if Marcus had returned, or if someone else was here. She took a slow step back, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife she kept at her waist. But then she heard a voice, familiar, yet not. Well, well, well. Look who finally showed up. Clara's blood ran cold. The voice was low, almost mocking, but the familiarity of it sent a chill down her spine. A man stepped out of the shadows, his figure tall and lean, wearing a long coat that seemed out of place in the otherwise cozy cabin. He had a sharp jawline, dark eyes, and a smile that didn't reach them. Clara's instincts screamed that this man was trouble. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline flooding her veins. Her hand was still on the knife, but she didn't want to make any hasty moves. The man chuckled, his eyes scanning her with a detached interest. "That's a good question," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "But I think you'll be more concerned with what happens next, don't you?" Clara didn't lower her guard. "What do you want with me?" The man's smile widened, his gaze flicking to the door behind her. "I think you know why I'm here. But Marcus seems to have forgotten his manners. I'm afraid you, and I have some unfinished business." Clara's stomach twisted. She knew that voice. It was one she hadn't heard in years. The last time she'd heard it, it had been from a man her father had warned her about, a man who had ties to Project Phoenix. This man wasn't just some random stranger. He was part of the game. And if he was here, then it meant things were about to get much worse. Who is this mysterious man? And what does he want with Clara? Can she trust Marcus? Or is he hiding even more than she realizes? And will Clara finally uncover the truth about her father's involvement in Project Phoenix before it's too late? The man's eyes gleamed with cold amusement as he stepped closer into the cabin, his presence unnerving and deliberate. Every step he took felt like a challenge, as if he was savoring the unease in the air. Clara's heart hammered against her ribcage, but she didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. She kept her grip on the knife at her waist, her eyes locked on his. "Who are you?" she demanded again, her voice low and steady, despite the rush of fear crawling up her spine. She had learned that asking the right questions was her best defense. The man let out a sigh, almost as if he was disappointed by her lack of recognition. His voice was smooth, almost too calm for the circumstances. "You really don't remember me, do you?" He leaned in slightly, his smile tightening. "I'm hurt, Clara." Her blood froze. Clara? How did he know her name? Her mind raced. She had never seen him before, yet there was something about his voice, his demeanor, that felt all too familiar, like a shadow from her past. "You're mistaken," Clara said, trying to buy herself time to think. "I don't know you." The man's smirk deepened. "Oh, I think you do. Maybe you've forgotten, but I haven't. It's funny, isn't it? How people forget the things they don't want to remember." He stepped closer, and this time Clara didn't back down. "You knew my name once. We were both part of the same project, part of your father's work." The name Project Phoenix echoed in Clara's mind, but she didn't allow herself to falter. "My father was a scientist. He wasn't involved in your work." The man's laugh was short, almost bitter. "Your father wasn't just a scientist, Clara. He was a key figure in Project Phoenix. He knew exactly what he was doing. He just didn't realize what he was unleashing until it was too late. I don't think he ever wanted to stop it. Not completely." Clara's stomach churned. She had been warned, by Marcus, by Emma, that her father's legacy was far from clean, but hearing it from someone who seemed to have been in the middle of it all made her doubt everything she thought she knew. "You're lying," Clara said, though her voice wavered. She wouldn't believe that her father, the man who had been her hero, could have been so involved in something so monstrous. "My father was a good man." The man tilted his head, as if weighing her words. Good? Oh, Clara, don't be naive. The world isn't so simple. Your father made choices, hard choices, that changed the course of everything. And now, well, now you're here to clean up his mess. Clara's mind was spinning. Every word he spoke unraveled another piece of the story she had been trying so hard to put together. Project Phoenix, her father's secret, and now her own involvement. Why do you want me? She asked, forcing herself to stay focused, despite the growing sense of dread. What does any of this have to do with me? The man's smile was cold, calculating. Because, Clara, you are the missing piece. Your father's project wasn't just about creating weapons. It was about creating control. And you, my dear, are the key to the next phase. They think you can finish what your father started. They think you can unlock the power of Project Phoenix. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. The people who had been hunting her since the moment she learned about her father's involvement in the project, they wanted her to complete his work, to finish the terrible legacy he had left behind. Her mind reeled. She had known it was bad, but she hadn't realized just how deep it ran. You're wrong, Clara said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay strong. I won't be a part of this. I'm not going to help you. The man's expression darkened, and for a moment, Clara wondered if she had made a mistake in defying him. But then, he chuckled softly, as though he had expected her response. Let's not pretend you have a choice, Clara, he said, his tone dropping into something more sinister. You may think you're in control of this situation, but you're not. They won't stop until they have you, and when they do, you'll be a part of something much bigger than you could ever imagine. You'll understand then that running from your fate is impossible. The man's words hung in the air like a heavy fog, but Clara didn't have time to dwell on them. As his last sentence lingered in her mind, the door behind her suddenly swung open, and Marcus stepped into the room, his face grim, his eyes darting between Clara and the man. Leave her alone, Marcus growled, his voice a low warning. The stranger turned slowly, raising an eyebrow. Ah, Marcus, I was wondering when you'd show up. He stepped back, crossing his arms, a smirk still playing on his lips. I'd ask how your little trip to the woods went, but I'm sure you're already aware of what's at stake here. You're both in deep, whether you like it or not. Marcus's jaw clenched, but Clara could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He didn't know this man, but Clara did. He was part of the puzzle she hadn't been able to piece together until now. This man wasn't just a random player. He was someone with answers she desperately needed. Who are you? Marcus demanded, stepping toward the stranger, his body tensed as if ready for a confrontation. The man chuckled, his eyes glinting. I think you know exactly who I am, Marcus. You've been trying to stay one step ahead, but it's too late. Clara's already in this mess. There's no turning back now. Clara watched the interaction carefully. Marcus wasn't acting like himself. He was on edge, almost defensive. Was he hiding something? Was he in on this from the beginning? The man turned back to Clara, ignoring Marcus. You're smart, Clara. I'll give you that. But it's too late to fight this. The people behind this project won't stop until they have you. Clara's mind was whirling. She was stuck between two powerful forces. One, a man who had been protecting her, or so she thought. The other, a stranger who claimed to know everything about her father's past. But she was no closer to the truth. All she had were more questions. I'm not finishing what my father started, Clara said with more conviction, her voice steady now. You don't understand. I don't want anything to do with your project. The man's eyes narrowed. You don't have a choice, Clara. You'll do what you're meant to do, whether you like it or not. Clara took a step back, her mind racing. There had to be a way out of this, a way to stop everything from going down the path her father had taken. Marcus stepped forward, placing a hand on her arm. His touch was gentle, almost protective, but Clara could see the tension in his face. Clara, we need to talk about this. We need to make a plan. We can't let them win. She turned to face him. But what if we're already too late? What is the real connection between Marcus and this mysterious man? Is Marcus hiding something from Clara, or is he truly trying to protect her? And can Clara resist the pull of Project Phoenix, Or will she be forced to become part of a legacy she doesn't want? Clara's mind raced, each new revelation spinning her world into deeper chaos. She had always trusted Marcus. He was her protector, the one constant in a sea of uncertainty. But now, with the mysterious man standing across from her, his smirk like a blade poised to strike, Clara wasn't so sure. Could she still trust Marcus, or had he been playing her all along? Marcus squeezed her arm gently, his grip firm and reassuring. But the uncertainty in his eyes was unmistakable. He wasn't as confident as he usually was. That realization hit Clara harder than any of the man's words. "I'm not going to let them use you, Clara," Marcus said quietly, but his voice carried an edge she hadn't heard before. "Not like they used your father." Clara swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. "But how do I know you're telling the truth, Marcus? How do I know you're not part of this? How do I know this man is lying?" The stranger, who had been watching the exchange with quiet amusement, spoke up again. "It's cute, really. The two of you trying to pretend like there's any innocence left in this mess. But the truth is simple. Clara is part of something far bigger than both of you. And you, Marcus, you're just a pawn in a game that's already been set in motion. You've been trying to protect her, but the moment she's involved, there's no escape. Not for either of you." Clara's pulse spiked. She turned her gaze back to Marcus, his expression now filled with frustration and something deeper. Regret? He looked as if he had heard this before. Maybe from someone else, maybe from the people who had been controlling his every move all along. "Who are you really, and what do you want with me?" Clara demanded, her voice shaking, though she tried to make it sound stronger than she felt. She needed answers. She couldn't move forward without them. The man chuckled darkly. "I'm just a messenger, Clara, an agent of change. You can call me Leo, though. That's what they call me." Marcus flinched at the name, and Clara noticed his eyes narrowing, a flicker of recognition, or fear, crossing his face. The tension in the room thickened. "You know him?" Clara asked, her voice low but urgent. Marcus hesitated before answering. He didn't want to drag Clara further into the shadows of his past, but the truth was, he had no choice anymore. "Yes, I've crossed paths with Leo before. He's one of them, one of the people behind Project Phoenix." Clara's stomach lurched. She had known Marcus had a history tied to her father's work, but hearing it out loud felt like a cold slap to the face. Leo smiled, as though pleased by the discomfort his words had caused. "I wasn't sure Marcus would tell you the truth, but it seems like he's finally stopped hiding." Clara took a step back, her heart pounding. She wanted to run, to escape from everything that had been thrust upon her. But there was no way out, not yet, not without understanding what was happening. "So, what exactly are you going to do now?" Clara asked, trying to regain some semblance of control. Leo's smile widened, and for a brief moment, Clara thought she saw something. Something like pity flicker in his eyes. "What I'm going to do, Clara, is offer you a choice. You can join us. Become the key to unlocking the next phase of Project Phoenix. Or you can refuse, and we'll make sure you don't get in our way. Either way, the project will continue. You'll just be a footnote in its history." Clara's blood ran cold. Join them? The thought alone made her skin crawl. But something in Leo's eyes told her this wasn't an empty threat. This was real. Her life, her father's legacy, and everything she had tried to escape from had come crashing down on her in that moment. "I'm not a part of your project," Clara said, her voice stronger now, though her mind was still reeling. "I'm not your pawn." Leo tilted his head slightly, studying her with a mix of curiosity and mild amusement. "We'll see. You don't have a choice, Clara. You'll either become the savior of Project Phoenix, or you'll become its greatest obstacle. But there's no escaping the inevitable. You'll be part of the project, whether you want to be or not." Clara's mind was reeling, her emotions a tangled mess. Leo's words were sinking in. There was no escaping it. It was terrifying, but she knew she couldn't just accept her fate without a fight. She had spent too long running, too long wondering if she was somehow meant to finish what her father had started. But now that she was here, she understood that she had a choice. Fight or fall into the abyss of her father's mistakes. "Clara, listen to me." Marcus's voice broke through her thoughts. She turned to him, her heart heavy with the weight of everything they had just learned. I'm not part of their plan. I was part of the team that tried to shut down Project Phoenix. That's why I'm here. That's why I've been trying to protect you. Clara's gaze softened, but doubt still gnawed at her. She wanted to believe him. She really did. But everything felt so uncertain, so manipulated. Could she trust him after everything? After the lies? After the revelations? What's the plan, Marcus? Clara asked quietly, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. She wasn't going to let herself be manipulated anymore. Marcus looked at Leo, then back at Clara. We need to stop Project Phoenix before it's too late. I don't know all the details yet, but Leo's right about one thing. They won't stop until they have you. We need to move, and we need to do it now. Clara nodded, taking in the gravity of his words. They had no time to waste. No matter how she felt about Marcus or Leo, the truth was clear. Her life was in danger, and she had to make a choice. But as she stood there, the air thick with tension, Clara realized something else. There was no longer any running. She had been caught in this web long before she had ever known. And now, it was time to take control of her own destiny. Clara took a deep breath. She had been running her entire life. But now, the only path forward was to face the truth head-on. I'm not going to let them control me, Clara said, her voice firm. I don't care what happens next. I'll fight. Leo's eyes darkened. So be it, he said coldly. But remember, Clara, you chose this. He turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the silence. You have 1 hour to decide, before we come for you. Choose wisely. As the door clicked shut behind him, Clara and Marcus were left standing in the middle of the cabin, the weight of the world pressing down on them. What will Clara do in the next hour? Will she join forces with Marcus to stop Project Phoenix, or will she have to face the consequences of her decision alone? Can she trust Marcus completely, or will more secrets come to light? The air inside the cabin grew heavy as the door clicked shut behind Leo. Clara stood frozen for a moment, her breath shallow. The weight of the decision ahead of her felt suffocating. 1 hour. That was all the time she had. Marcus's eyes were locked on the door, a storm of thoughts swirling behind them. He didn't need to say anything. Clara could tell he was just as torn as she was, caught between wanting to protect her and needing to do what was right. I'm not going to let them win, Marcus, Clara said, her voice surprisingly steady. She clenched her fists at her sides, the reality of the situation settling in. The uncertainty, the fear. It was all there, but so was the resolve. She wasn't going to let her father's legacy define her anymore. She wasn't going to let them use her as a pawn. Marcus's face softened, his usual confident expression now clouded with doubt. He stepped toward her, his presence solid and reassuring. I never wanted any of this for you, Clara. If there was another way, I'd take it. But I need you to understand. Whatever you choose, it won't be easy. They'll come after you, no matter what. There's no turning back once you make this decision. Clara nodded, her mind made up. She could feel the pull of her father's past, the weight of his research hanging over her. But this wasn't his fight anymore. This was hers. I know, she whispered, her heart racing. But I can't keep running. I have to face this head-on. The tension between them was thick, but Clara could see the pride in Marcus's eyes. He had always believed in her. But now, more than ever, she had to prove that she could stand on her own. Marcus let out a slow breath, a resigned sigh. All right, then let's get ready. We have an hour. They wasted no time. Marcus moved quickly to the small table in the corner of the room, rifling through his bag for a set of blueprints. Clara watched him, her mind still racing with questions. About Leo, about the project, and most importantly, about herself. But right now, she couldn't afford distractions. She had to focus. We'll need to get to the old warehouse, Marcus said, pulling out a map of the city. It's where they're keeping the final phase of the project. If we can destroy the data, it'll set them back for months, maybe longer. But that's assuming they don't have security there. Clara nodded, scanning the map. The warehouse was on the outskirts of the city, hidden away in an industrial area that was nearly impossible to reach without drawing attention. But that was exactly what made it a perfect target. How do we get in? She asked, trying to piece together the details of the plan. Distraction, Marcus replied, his eyes glinting with a sudden intensity. We'll need to cause a diversion, something big enough to draw their attention away from the data center. While they're busy, we'll slip in and do what we need to do. Clara's heart pounded at the thought of what they were about to attempt. She had no idea how they could pull it off, but the adrenaline that had been building up since Leo's visit pushed her forward. "Do you have a plan for the diversion?" she asked, her mind working quickly to assess their resources. Marcus looked at her, his expression more serious than she had ever seen it. "I do, but it's dangerous. You don't have to do this with me." Clara's gaze hardened. She wasn't about to back down now. "We're in this together, Marcus. Whatever it takes." He nodded slowly, his lips tightening in determination. "All right, we move in 20 minutes. Get ready." The next 20 minutes were a blur of activity. Clara gathered the few supplies they would need: flashlights, a few spare weapons Marcus had hidden in his pack, and a portable hard drive that might come in handy. It was a strange feeling to know that in less than an hour, her life might change forever. "Do you think we can actually stop them?" Clara asked as they made their final preparations. Marcus was silent for a long moment before answering. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost as if he were speaking more to himself than to Clara. "I don't know, but we have to try. If we don't, they win. And if they win, there's no telling how far they'll go." Clara felt the weight of his words, and for the first time, she realized just how much was riding on her decision. She wasn't just fighting for her own survival anymore. She was fighting for something bigger. Her father's research, the lives of the people who had been affected by Project Phoenix, and the future that was still in her hands. She wasn't going to let them win. The drive to the warehouse was tense, the streets eerily empty at this hour. The city was quiet, as if it too was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Clara stared out the window, her thoughts churning with the possibilities. What if we fail? What if Leo was right? What if there's no stopping this? But there was no time for doubt. As they neared the warehouse district, the darkness seemed to stretch out before them like an endless void. Marcus slowed the car, his eyes scanning the area. The warehouse loomed in the distance, its dark, looming silhouette a constant reminder of the danger that lay ahead. "We'll park here," Marcus whispered, pulling into a narrow alley. "From here on foot. Stay close." Clara nodded, her pulse quickening. They exited the car and moved swiftly into the shadows, the weight of their mission heavy on their shoulders. They had made it this far, but as they neared the warehouse, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. They were being watched. Will Clara and Marcus make it into the warehouse undetected, or will they be ambushed before they can complete their mission? And who else is out there watching them? The real danger may be closer than they think. Clara's every sense was on high alert as they crept through the alleyway toward the warehouse. Her heart raced, adrenaline coursing through her veins, but her mind was still filled with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Would they be able to stop Project Phoenix? Or would they fall into a trap? Marcus led the way, his movements quick and silent, eyes darting around as he checked every corner. Clara stayed close behind, her breathing shallow. The further they moved into the industrial area, the more her instincts screamed that something was off. They reached the back of the warehouse, the large steel doors looming ominously in front of them. There was a small side entrance, one that Marcus had marked on the blueprint as their best option. It was hidden in the shadows, with no visible cameras or guards. At least, that's what they thought. Marcus approached the door cautiously and pulled out a small device from his jacket pocket. It was a bypass tool, used to hack into basic security systems. His fingers moved quickly, expertly manipulating the device. The door clicked, and Marcus gestured for Clara to follow him. Just as they were about to step inside, Clara froze. A faint sound, almost imperceptible, came from behind them. A soft clink of metal, followed by the sound of a footstep too light to be accidental. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. He turned, his hand instinctively going to the gun at his hip. They were being followed. The alleyway behind them was dark, but Clara could make out the outline of several figures moving toward them, quickly, silently, and deliberately. "Get inside. Now," Marcus hissed, pushing Clara toward the door. But before she could move, the sound of footsteps grew louder. The figures were closing in. "Ambush," Marcus muttered under his breath. Clara didn't hesitate. She shoved herself into the doorway, Marcus right behind her. They slammed the door shut just as they heard the sound of footsteps stopping outside. For a moment, there was silence. But Clara could feel the tension crackling in the air, a sense of inevitability that they had walked right into a trap. The inside of the warehouse was cold, its high ceilings echoing with every sound. Rows of stacked crates lined the space, and overhead lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the concrete floor. The silence between Clara and Marcus was thick, both of them listening for any movement from outside. "Do you think they saw us?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," Marcus replied, his tone tense. "But it doesn't matter now. We need to get to the data center before they figure out where we are." They moved quickly, staying low and using the crates as cover as they made their way toward the far end of the warehouse. Clara's mind raced. If they could just reach the data center, they could destroy the files, and maybe, just maybe, they could stop the project. But every step they took felt heavier, as though the walls themselves were closing in on them. Just as they rounded a corner, Clara's heart stopped. There, standing in the shadows, was Leo. His smirk was wide and knowing, as if he had been expecting them. "I thought you might make it this far," Leo said, his voice smooth and mocking. "But you're too late." Clara's stomach churned. So they had known. They had been watching them the entire time. Marcus stepped forward, his eyes narrowing in anger. "This is it, Leo. You've gone too far. If you think we're just going to let you walk away from this, you're wrong." Leo chuckled, the sound echoing in the large, empty space. "You still don't get it, do you? You're the one who walked into this, Marcus. You're the one who dragged Clara into this mess. You think you can just destroy everything and walk away unscathed? No, Marcus. The project is bigger than you, bigger than any of us." Clara's thoughts spun. What did he mean by that? Could Leo really be that confident? What was the project's true scope? Marcus's voice was firm, almost resigned. "We're ending it now, Leo. There's no more running. You'll pay for everything." Leo's eyes gleamed as he stepped forward, his hands raised in mock surrender. "Oh, I'm not the one you need to worry about. You've already lost." Before Clara could react, Leo snapped his fingers. Suddenly, the warehouse lights flickered and went out completely, plunging them into darkness. The sound of rushing footsteps filled the air. Clara's heart raced, her eyes straining to adjust to the blackness. She couldn't see anything, nothing except the faint outlines of the crates around her. Marcus's hand shot out, gripping her wrist tightly. "We need to move. Now," he hissed. Clara nodded, her mind focused solely on survival. She could hear the sound of metal scraping against concrete, the unmistakable sound of guns being drawn. They were surrounded. They had walked straight into a trap, and now there was no escape. As they ran toward the back of the warehouse, a voice rang out in the dark, cutting through the tension. "Don't bother running. You're not going anywhere," Leo's voice called out, smooth as silk, but laced with malice. Clara's pulse quickened. They had to find a way to outsmart him, now, before it was too late. They reached the far wall of the warehouse, and Clara's eyes darted around, trying to spot anything that could help them. Her gaze landed on a small control panel near the wall. It was a long shot, but if she could disable the security system, they might have a chance to escape. "Marcus, the panel," she whispered urgently. Marcus nodded, moving toward the panel, his hand reaching for his tool. They were so close, but Clara could hear the sound of boots approaching, too close. Just as Marcus began to work on the panel, a loud crash echoed from the other side of the room. Clara spun around, her heart skipping a beat. Several figures emerged from the shadows, more of Leo's men, their eyes cold and calculating. "Game over, Clara," Leo said, his voice as chilling as ever. "You had your chance." With Leo's men closing in and no clear way out, will Clara and Marcus find a way to survive this ambush? Can they destroy the data before it's too late? Or will Leo's plan succeed? The walls are closing in, and the choices Clara makes now could determine everything. The darkness seemed to press in on Clara, as though the very walls of the warehouse were closing around them. Her heart pounded in her chest as Leo's men stepped closer, their eyes glinting with cold determination. Clara's thoughts raced. There had to be a way out. There had to be something they could do to stop this. Marcus was working furiously at the control panel, his fingers flying over the buttons with practiced speed. The seconds felt like hours, each moment stretching out painfully as Leo's voice echoed through the room. "Don't waste your time, Marcus," Leo taunted, his voice dripping with confidence. "You can't stop this. It's already too late." Clara clenched her fists, trying to push the panic away. She couldn't let fear take over now. She couldn't let Leo win. She turned toward Marcus, her eyes locking onto him. His jaw was set, his face taut with concentration, but Clara could see the sweat beading on his forehead. He was close, so close to getting them access to the control systems. "Just a little longer," Marcus muttered under his breath, as though trying to reassure himself as much as her. But it wasn't long before Leo made his move. "Enough games," Leo said coldly, snapping his fingers. At his signal, his men surged forward. Clara's pulse spiked, and before she could react, one of Leo's men lunged toward Marcus, gun raised. "No!" Clara screamed, but it was too late. The gunshot rang through the air. Time seemed to slow as Clara's body tensed in terror. The sound echoed in her ears, drowning out everything else. She saw Marcus's body jerk back from the impact, his face contorted in pain as he fell to the ground. Clara's breath hitched. "No, no, no, no." Tears blurred her vision, but Clara didn't stop. Rage surged through her as she ran toward Marcus, instinct taking over. She pushed the man aside, her hands reaching for Marcus as she dropped beside him. "Marcus!" she cried, her voice breaking. He was alive, barely, but the blood staining his shirt told her everything. She pressed her hand to his wound, trying to stop the bleeding, but it was clear they didn't have much time. The world around her seemed to fade as she focused on Marcus, but her mind raced. Leo's plan was still unfolding, and they were running out of time. If she didn't act fast, everything they had fought for would be lost. "Clara," Marcus gasped, his voice weak. His hand gripped hers with surprising strength. "You have to finish this. You can't stop now." Clara shook her head, her eyes filled with panic. "I can't. Marcus, please. Don't leave me." But Marcus's gaze was steady, his voice a whisper of reassurance. "You can do this, Clara. You have to. You're stronger than you think. Finish what we started. It's the only way." The sound of Leo's men advancing was like thunder in her ears. Clara knew that she didn't have any more time to grieve. She had to make a choice: stay and risk losing everything, or push forward and try to save what was left of her father's work. Clara stood up abruptly, wiping her tears away. She glanced at Marcus one last time, then turned toward the control panel. There was no other option. Clara's feet moved without hesitation as she sprinted toward the panel. Her mind was laser-focused, the weight of the world on her shoulders. Her fingers brushed over the buttons, her heart pounding in her ears as she tried to make sense of the complex system in front of her. The screen flashed with cryptic codes, but Clara had seen enough of these systems in her father's research to know what to do. She took a deep breath and typed in the override code. Nothing. Her pulse quickened. She could hear Leo's men coming closer, their footsteps echoing off the concrete. She couldn't afford to fail now. She tried again, typing faster, more urgently. The code wasn't working. "No," Clara muttered under her breath, fear beginning to claw at her chest. She thought back to the blueprint Marcus had shown her, the one that had outlined the location of the server room and the critical data files. She remembered one key detail that might save them. There was a backup terminal hidden beneath the floor panels. It was a last-ditch effort in case someone tried to tamper with the system. If she could get to it, she could bypass the main controls and destroy the data. Clara didn't think twice. She shoved aside the control panel and rushed to the corner of the room, where a hidden trapdoor lay beneath a pile of crates. Her hands shook as she pulled up the floor panel and scrambled down into the darkness below. The small room beneath the warehouse was claustrophobic, with a low ceiling and barely enough space to move. But in the center of the room stood what Clara needed: another control station, larger and more complex than the one upstairs. She ran toward it, praying it was still functional. The hum of the terminal's machinery filled the space, and Clara quickly got to work, her mind focused entirely on the task at hand. But just as she was about to input the override command, something cold brushed against her neck, a voice, low and threatening. "Did you really think you could stop this, Clara?" Clara froze, her breath caught in her throat. She turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. There, standing in the doorway, was Leo. But this time, there was no mockery in his eyes, only cold, hard determination. "You should have joined me, Clara," he said, his voice calm, almost pitying. "This was never about stopping Project Phoenix. This was about controlling it. And you were never meant to be the hero." With Leo standing in front of her, and the fate of everything she's worked for hanging by a thread, will Clara manage to destroy the data and stop Leo's plan? Or has she already lost? The next move could determine not only her future, but the future of everyone involved. Clara's hand trembled on the keyboard, but she didn't let go. She could feel Leo's gaze burning into her, his presence a cold weight in the room. Every instinct told her to run, to escape, but she knew she couldn't leave the terminal. This was the moment where everything would either be lost or saved. Leo took a slow step toward her, his footsteps deliberate, his expression unreadable. "Do you think you can stop me?" His voice was steady, calm, but there was a dangerous edge underneath. "You should have joined me when you had the chance. Together, we could have controlled everything. But now you'll only destroy what you don't understand." Clara's mind raced. She had no choice now. She had to finish what she started. She couldn't let Leo's vision of control become a reality. Not after everything her father had sacrificed. Not after everything they had fought for. "Get out of my way, Leo," she said, her voice low and steady, surprising even herself with the defiance that bled into her tone. She wasn't going to be intimidated by him anymore. Leo smirked, taking another step forward. "You think you can threaten me, Clara? I'm not the one in danger here." For a moment, Clara was paralyzed by the realization of just how much danger she was in. She was alone, trapped in a small room with Leo and his men closing in. She glanced down at the terminal, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. If she could just finish entering the code, the system would shut down. The files, the entire project, would be destroyed. But Leo wasn't going to let that happen. "You think you've won," he continued, his voice almost a whisper, "but you're too late. The moment you walked into this warehouse, it was already over." Clara's fingers brushed the keys, trying to stay focused, but her thoughts were a whirlwind. Had she made a mistake? Was there a way out of this? Could she even trust herself anymore? Before she could make up her mind, Leo moved with a sudden speed. He was on her in an instant, grabbing her wrist and wrenching her away from the terminal. Clara gasped, the pain of his grip cutting through her like a knife. "Don't touch me," she shouted, but Leo only tightened his hold. "You're not in charge here, Clara," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And you never will be." With one forceful push, Leo shoved her toward the wall, and Clara stumbled, barely able to catch herself. The sharp edge of a crate dug into her side, but she quickly righted herself, pain shooting through her body. She was shaken, but not defeated. Not yet. The room was filled with tension as Leo's men stood at the entrance, their guns trained on her. Clara's mind raced for a solution. She couldn't give up now, not when she was so close. "Leo, you're wrong," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "It's not too late. I can still stop this." Leo tilted his head, his smirk fading for just a moment. "You think you can stop me, Clara? You've seen the files. You know what we're capable of. You're too naive to understand the magnitude of what's happening." Clara clenched her fists, feeling the weight of his words, but she wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything they'd been through. "You're the naive one," she retorted. "You think you can control this? But you can't. You can't control people, Leo. That's where you're wrong." Leo's expression darkened, and for the first time, Clara saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. It was brief, but enough to give her hope. He wasn't invincible. He was just a man, and men could be defeated. But before Clara could make her next move, The sound of gunfire rang out from above, echoing through the small space. Clara whipped her head up, instinctively ducking as the bullet whizzed past her, inches from her ear. She turned back to Leo, panic seizing her chest as she realized what was happening. "Now, you're in real trouble," Leo said, his eyes lighting up with satisfaction. "They're already here." Clara's heart skipped a beat as a loud crash echoed from the far side of the warehouse, followed by the unmistakable sound of boots pounding the ground. Her pulse raced. There was no time left. She had to make a decision. In that moment, Clara's mind cleared. She knew what she had to do. She looked directly into Leo's eyes, her voice calm and steady despite the chaos surrounding her. "You're not the one in control here anymore." Leo raised an eyebrow, but before he could respond, Clara lunged toward the terminal once more, her fingers flying over the keys. As she typed in the override command, she heard the sound of footsteps growing louder. More people were coming, and it wasn't just Leo's men. A loud crash echoed from above, and Clara knew the team from outside had made it. They were here. They had finally arrived. Clara's fingers hit the final key. There was a moment of silence as the terminal beeped, and then, with a series of rapid beeps and flashing red lights, the system went into lockdown. Leo's face twisted with fury as the screens around him began to flash with warning messages. The files, the data, everything he had worked so hard to control, was disappearing. Clara couldn't believe it. It was happening. They had done it. "No!" Leo screamed, his face contorting in rage. "You can't. I was so close." Clara barely had time to react before she was grabbed by the arm and pulled into the shadows. She turned just in time to see Marcus, his face pale but determined, standing there, the gun he had taken from one of Leo's men in his hand. "You're not alone," he said, his voice weak but resolute. "We've got this." Clara's heart swelled with relief, but there was no time to waste. Leo was still dangerous, and his men were closing in. "Let's go," Marcus said urgently, grabbing her hand. "We need to get out of here before he regains control." Together, Clara and Marcus sprinted toward the exit, the sound of chaos echoing behind them. Leo's men were moving in, but they were disoriented now, scrambling to salvage what little they could. As they rounded the corner of the warehouse, they heard Leo shouting orders, his voice hoarse with anger. But it was too late. The project was over. And for Clara and Marcus, there was finally hope. As they stepped outside into the fading light of day, Clara glanced back one last time. The battle wasn't over, but they had won this fight. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Clara allowed herself to believe that they could build something better, something that wasn't controlled by fear. Months passed, and the remnants of Project Phoenix were scattered. The world was left to rebuild, but Clara knew that they had started something new, something that could change everything. She sat in her father's study, the one place that still felt like home. As she looked at the blueprint he had left behind, she realized that while Leo may have had his vision, it was hers now. A vision of freedom, of hope, and of a future where people were never controlled again. She smiled to herself. The fight had just begun. What do you think Clara's future holds? Will she be able to build a better world? Or will the shadows of the past catch up with her? Let us know your thoughts below.